It began with winter closing its fist around the Ardennes. Snow didn't fall gently that week. It came down in sheets, thick enough to erase the horizon, sharp enough to sting the skin, heavy enough to swallow entire roads. The sky stayed the same colour for days, a cold, merciless grey that felt almost metallic. Trees stood like frozen pillars, their branches bowed under the weight of ice. Visibility shrank to a world of white and breath and fear. And somewhere beneath that storm, surrounded on all sides, cut off from warmth, supplies, and hope, the defenders of Bastogne held on by willpower alone. Patton learned what was happening not from calm reports, but from the frantic drip of panicked information, fragments of messages, broken radio calls, commanders speaking too quickly because the situation was collapsing too fast. A spearhead of the German offensive had surged deep into the lines. Roads were lost, towns had fallen. Bastogne, that stubborn little crossroads town, was surrounded. If it fell, the enemy advance would explode outward like fire-fed fresh oxygen. Patton didn't hesitate. He didn't pause. He didn't wait to see how bad the situation would get. He turned his entire army, in the dead of winter, against terrain that rejected movement, against weather that hated human life, against time itself. His staff stared at him in disbelief. They knew the roads were buried in snow. They knew tanks would freeze where they sat. They knew engines would choke. They knew visibility was almost zero. This wasn't a drive. This was an attempt to outrun a storm that wanted to break everything in its path. But Patton saw it differently. He didn't see miles. He didn't see weather. He didn't see obstacles. He saw men trapped in Bastogne, waiting for someone who refused to fail them. The Third Army pivoted like a giant, forced to move in a single breath. Entire armoured columns redirected. Supply routes rewired. Thousands of soldiers given new orders. Maps were rewritten. Positions inverted. The only constant was speed, brutal, impossible, unrelenting speed. And then they began the drive north. Engines roared awake in the freezing dark. Tanks pushed through drifts of snow, tall enough to swallow their tracks. Trucks skidded on ice, so clear it looked like glass. Men marched with snow crusted onto their shoulders, their breath forming clouds that trailed behind them like ghosts. Frost clung to rifles, mud froze into armour. The cold became a weapon, sharper than any blade. Every mile to Bastogne felt like a test the winter dared them to fail. German patrols struck from the tree line. Artillery echoed through fog, thick enough to hide entire battalions. Bridges cracked under weight. Roads that existed on maps disappeared beneath ice. And still they pressed forward, inch by inch, mile by mile, breath by frozen breath. Patton's drive to Bastogne was not clean, not easy, not glorious. It was desperate. It was frantic. It was punishing, but it was necessary. And when the first American tanks reached the outskirts of Bastogne, pushing into the snow-covered silence that had swallowed the town, the siege cracked not with spectacle, but with relief so deep it felt like the forest exhaled. Tonight, we return to that drive, to the cold that burned skin, to the engines that shook frozen air, to the men who forced winter itself to move aside, to the moment when Patton's determination became the lifeline for an encircled town fighting to survive. Before we continue, I want to ask you something gently, in your own words. As you listen tonight, what kind of warmth surrounds you? A blanket? A soft room? A quiet moment you carved out for yourself? Tell me the feeling, not the object. And something deeper, unique to this story. Patton's men moved because someone believed in them more than they believed in themselves. In your life, has there ever been a person who believed in you at a moment when you were unsure of yourself? If you feel comfortable, share their name. And if these slow journeys into the past help you ease your mind, settle your breathing, or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. December 15th, 1944. A young private from Iowa stands in a frozen foxhole near the Belgian village of Losheim, writing a letter home by the light of a guttering candle. "Dear Mum," he writes, "they've sent us to the quietest part of the whole front. Nothing ever happens here. Might actually make it home for next Christmas." He seals the envelope, stamps it with cold, stiffened fingers, and settles into his blanket. In 11 hours, he will be dead. His position will be overrun by an army he never saw coming, part of a surprise attack so complete that American intelligence would call it the greatest failure since Pearl Harbor. The sector he occupied, an 85-mile stretch of forested Belgian hills called the Ardennes, was known throughout the American forces as the Ghost Front. It earned that name because nothing ever happened there, because it was where exhausted divisions went to rest, because the war seemed to have passed it by entirely. But on this cold December night, 250,000 German soldiers are moving into position just beyond the tree line. They are about to transform the Ghost Front into the bloodiest battlefield American forces would ever fight on European soil. The Ardennes in December 1944 was supposed to be the easy posting, the sector where units recuperated after the brutal fighting in places like Hürtgen Forest. 4 American divisions held those 85 miles of front, a stretch that should have required 8 to 10 divisions by any reasonable military calculation. But the logic seemed sound enough. The terrain was difficult, thick forests cut through with narrow ravines and poor roads, completely unsuitable for major offensive operations. The Germans were supposedly on their last legs, reeling from the liberation of France, barely holding defensive positions along the Siegfried Line. Allied intelligence officers had convinced themselves that the Wehrmacht simply lacked the strength for anything but local counterattacks. So the Ardennes became the quiet sector, the place where the battered 28th Infantry Division went to recover from losing over 3,000 men in the Hürtgen nightmare. Fresh divisions like the 106th Infantry arrived straight from England. Green troops who had never heard a shot fired in anger, told they were getting a gentle introduction to combat. The villages were quaint, the Belgian farmers friendly, and the German artillery across the valley fired only sporadically, more nuisance than threat. But in the forests, on the German side of the line, something unprecedented was taking place. Throughout November and December, 250,000 men were moving into position under the strictest radio silence the German military had ever enforced. Entire panzer divisions travelled only at night, their vehicles camouflaged with fresh-cut pine branches, their assembly areas hidden beneath the dense canopy of the Eifel forests. Hitler himself had ordered the operation, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive-sounding name designed to fool Allied intelligence. The objective was breathtaking in its ambition. Break through the Ardennes, drive a wedge between American and British forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was desperate, perhaps delusional, but Hitler committed his last strategic reserves to the gamble. 30 divisions, 1,400 tanks, 2,000 artillery pieces, all moving into position in complete secrecy, preparing to strike at the weakest point of the Allied line. The intelligence warning signs were there, but they were missed or misinterpreted at every turn. Ultra-intercepts, the supposedly infallible code-breaking that gave the Allies access to German high command communications, had detected unusual troop movements. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed an increase in rail traffic heading toward the Eifel region. Local reports from Belgian civilians spoke of hearing tank engines in the night, seeing unusual concentrations of vehicles. But at every level of American and British intelligence, these warnings were rationalized away. The Germans were too weak for a major offensive, analysts insisted. They were likely preparing defensive positions or perhaps planning a limited counterattack to disrupt Allied offensive operations elsewhere. Weather forecasters contributed to the complacency, predicting solid, overcast conditions through at least December 23rd, which meant Allied air superiority would be negated. But that information was treated as a tactical inconvenience, not a strategic opportunity for an enemy attack. Even General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, would later write that he considered the Ardennes a calculated risk, a thin sector that freed up divisions for offensives further north and south. The calculation was about to prove catastrophically wrong. On December 15th, the day before the attack, small clues accumulated that something was terribly wrong. A platoon commander in the 99th Division reported hearing German voices and what sounded like tank engines moving in the fog-shrouded forest across from his position. His report was acknowledged but not acted upon. A reconnaissance patrol captured a German soldier who, under interrogation, spoke of a major offensive coming soon. The prisoner was dismissed as spreading disinformation. In the 8 Corps sector, which held the center of the Ardennes line, General Troy Middleton felt uneasy about his positions but had no concrete reason to request reinforcements. His headquarters staff noted that German artillery fire had decreased over the past few days, which might mean the enemy was hoarding ammunition for something. But for what? Nobody could say. As darkness fell on the 15th, the temperature dropped towards 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers huddled in their foxholes, dreaming of mail from home and hot food. The forests were silent except for the wind in the pine trees. It was the last quiet night the Ardennes would know for 6 weeks. At exactly 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the silence shattered. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along the 85-mile front. The American private from Iowa, still sleeping in his foxhole, probably never knew what killed him. The barrage was unlike anything American forces in Europe had experienced, a rolling thunder that lasted for 90 minutes, chewing up command posts, severing communication lines, and destroying forward observation posts. In the pre-dawn darkness, the Germans employed a terrifying innovation. Searchlights aimed at the low cloud cover, bouncing light off the clouds to create an eerie, artificial moonlight they called Kunstlicht, artificial daylight. Under this ghostly illumination, German infantry waves began moving forward. Behind them, the panzers waited for the breakthrough that Hitler had promised would come within hours. The soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division, some of whom had been in the line for less than a week, found themselves facing veteran troops from German Volksgrenadier divisions who had one objective: punch through to the roads beyond, open the route for the armour. The American response was chaos. Communication lines were cut, runners couldn't find headquarters, and entire battalions lost contact with their parent regiments. In the village of Losheim, the gap between the 99th and 106th Divisions became a highway for German forces. The 14th Cavalry Group, responsible for screening that gap, was simply overrun. Survivors spoke later of hearing German voices shouting in English, directing American units down the wrong roads, creating confusion and panic. Further south, German commandos under Otto Skorzeny, dressed in American uniforms and driving captured American jeeps, infiltrated behind the lines to change road signs, cut communication wires, and spread rumors of massive German breakthroughs. The tactic was more effective psychologically than militarily. Within hours, paranoia spread through American rear areas. Military police set up checkpoints, demanding that soldiers prove their identity by answering questions about American culture. Who won the World Series? What's the capital of Illinois? Who's married to Betty Grable? More than one genuine American soldier was detained because he didn't follow baseball or failed a pop culture quiz administered by a suspicious MP. By midday on December 16th, the scale of the disaster was becoming clear to Allied high command. Eisenhower's headquarters at Versailles received fragmentary reports of attacks all along the Ardennes front, but the communications breakdown made it impossible to understand the full picture. Bradley initially dismissed it as a spoiling attack, perhaps 15 divisions trying to disrupt the planned Allied offensive toward the Roer River dams. But as the day wore on and the reports grew more alarming, the truth became unavoidable. This was not a spoiling attack. This was a major offensive, perhaps the last throw of the dice, by a desperate enemy, but massive and dangerous nonetheless. The Ghost Front had become the center of the war. Villages whose names appeared on no American maps, places like Luxembourg and Streetvith and Bastogne, were about to become household words back in the United States. And somewhere to the south, prosecuting his own offensive in the Saar region, General George S. Patton received a phone call that would lead to his finest and most controversial achievement. The first night of the attack was chaos across the entire front. Some American units fought with desperate courage, holding positions far longer than seemed possible. The 99th Infantry Division, positioned on the northern shoulder of the German attack, refused to break despite being outnumbered 5-1. Their stand at Elsenborn Ridge would prove crucial in the coming days, denying the Germans access to the best roads north toward the Meuse River. Further south, at the town of Street, Vith, the 7th Armoured Division, was rushing forward to reinforce the collapsing front. But in other sectors, entire regiments simply ceased to exist. The 106th Division's two forward regiments, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry, found themselves cut off and surrounded on a forested ridge called the Schnee Eifel. Over the next 3 days, 8,000 American soldiers would be forced to surrender, the largest mass surrender of US forces in Europe during the entire war. The disaster was complete, the surprise total. The Ghost Front had been haunted, after all, not by phantoms but by a German army that Allied intelligence swore no longer existed. As December 17th dawned, American soldiers throughout the Ardennes faced a terrifying realization. They were alone, cut off from higher command, unsure who was winning or losing, uncertain even where the enemy was. In the forests and villages of Belgium, small groups of Americans fought desperate defensive actions, buying time they didn't know anyone needed. Company commanders made decisions that should have been made by generals, because the generals couldn't be reached. Platoon sergeants found themselves commanding battalions because everyone above them was dead or missing. It was warfare at its most primitive and terrifying, and it was about to get worse. Because racing toward those same forests, their engines roaring and tracks churning the frozen ground, were the elite panzer divisions that had been Hitler's strategic reserve. They were behind schedule, frustrated by American resistance that should have collapsed in hours, hungry for the breakthrough that would vindicate their Führer's gamble, and in their path lay a small Belgian town whose name would become synonymous with American courage and German frustration, Bastogne. 6 a.m., December 16th, 1944. Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper stands in the cupola of his Panther tank, watching the artillery preparation tear apart the American lines ahead. His Kampfgruppe, a battle group of 4,000 SS troops and 100 tanks, represents the tip of the spear for 6th SS Panzer Army, the formation tasked with making the decisive breakthrough. Piper has been promised that the Americans will collapse within hours, that by nightfall he'll be racing toward the Meuse River bridges, and that by Christmas he'll be in Antwerp. The promise sounds absurd, even to him, a combat veteran who fought on the Eastern Front and knows what modern defensive warfare looks like. But orders are orders, and Paper's reputation is built on aggressive action. When the artillery stops and the signal comes, his column will punch through whatever remains of American resistance and simply not stop. No prisoners, no delays, no caution. The German offensive called Wacht am Rhein is about to reveal both the Wehrmacht's remaining power and its fatal weaknesses. The first hours of the German attack achieved everything Hitler's planners had hoped for. Along the 85-mile front, American positions simply ceased to exist under the weight of the artillery barrage. The Volksgrenadier divisions, infantry units hastily raised and trained in the last months of 1944, pushed through the shattered American lines with surprising effectiveness. Behind them, waiting for the breakthrough, sat the real striking power. 2 panzer armies, 6th SS Panzer Army in the north under Sepp Dietrich, and 5th Panzer Army in the center under Hasso von Manteuffel. These formations represented Germany's last mobile reserves, scraped together from units pulled from the collapsing Eastern Front, rebuilt shattered divisions, and the strategic reserve Hitler had been hoarding since the Normandy invasion, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, including the feared Panthers and the nearly invincible King Tigers, 2,000 artillery pieces, given ammunition allocations they hadn't seen since the glory days of 1940, 250,000 men, attacking an American force of 80,000, spread too thin across impossible terrain. By every conventional military calculation, the Germans should have won a decisive victory in the first 72 hours. But within hours, the offensive was already behind schedule, and the reasons why would ultimately doom the entire operation. Piper's Kampfgruppe encountered its first serious problem at the village of Lanzerath, where a single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of 18 men held a critical crossroads. The platoon, vastly outnumbered, fought from prepared positions throughout the morning, calling in artillery fire that disrupted German formations. When Piper's column finally overran the position that afternoon, he had lost 6 precious hours. It seemed trivial, a minor delay in a massive operation, but Hitler's plan was built on an impossibly tight timetable. 1st Panzer Army had to reach the Meuse River bridges within 48 hours before American reinforcements could arrive. Every hour of delay multiplied the risk of failure, and Piper was learning what German commanders on the Eastern Front already knew. American forces, even when surprised and outnumbered, fought back with artillery support and aggressive small unit tactics that German doctrine hadn't prepared for. The Wehrmacht was discovering that this would not be France in 1940, where Allied armies had collapsed in confusion. These Americans were stubborn. The fuel crisis began on day 1 and never stopped getting worse. Hitler's planners had allocated 5 million gallons of fuel for the offensive, but the Wehrmacht's shattered logistics system could only deliver half that amount to the front. The plan therefore relied on a desperate expedient: capture American fuel depots intact and use enemy supplies to continue the advance. On paper, it seemed almost reasonable. The Americans had massive fuel dumps scattered throughout Belgium and Luxembourg, supporting the vast vehicle fleets of their mechanized armies. If German panzers could overrun just a few of these depots in the first days of the offensive, they could keep moving west. But the assumption proved catastrophically wrong. American forces, even in retreat, destroyed or evacuated their fuel supplies. Piper's Kampfgruppe racing ahead of the main German advance, began running low on fuel by the end of the second day. His tanks started breaking down from mechanical failures caused by hasty wartime production, and the roads themselves, supposedly the reason for attacking through the Ardennes, proved barely adequate for modern armor. Narrow, winding forest tracks became choked with disabled vehicles. Panthers threw tracks on sharp corners. King Tigers, weighing 70 tons, collapsed bridges never designed for such loads. The lightning breakthrough was becoming a grinding traffic jam. December 17th brought the incident that would forever stain Paper's Kampfgruppe and provide American propaganda with its most powerful symbol of German brutality. At the crossroads near Malmedy, Piper's lead elements captured an American convoy, over 100 men from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Americans were disarmed and herded into a field beside the road. Accounts of what happened next are disputed in details, but clear in outcome. SS troops opened fire with machine guns, methodically killing 84 unarmed prisoners. Some Americans survived by playing dead in the snow. Others ran for nearby woods and were hunted down. When the massacre was discovered the next day, the news spread through American units like wildfire. No quarter for SS became an unofficial policy in some sectors. The propaganda value for American morale was immense. Soldiers now fought with the certainty that surrender to SS units meant death. The Malmedy massacre ensured that the Battle of the Bulge would be remembered not just as a military crisis, but as a moral struggle against an enemy that had abandoned the laws of war. By December 18th, the German offensive was achieving tactical successes, but strategic failure was already visible to clear-eyed observers. In the north, 6th SS Panzer Army had stalled completely. The stubborn American defense at Elsenborn Ridge denied Dietrich's forces access to the main roads toward Liège and the Meuse crossings. Piper's Kampfgruppe, the spearhead that was supposed to be in Antwerp by Christmas, was trapped in the village of Stoumont, surrounded by American forces and critically low on fuel. Piper's radio messages back to headquarters grew increasingly desperate. Supply situation critical, route blocked, await orders. The orders that came back were impossible. Continue attack, refuel from captured stocks. But there were no captured stocks. The Americans had evacuated or destroyed everything. In the center sector, 5th Panzer Army under Manteuffel was making better progress, pushing American forces back toward the Meuse. But even here, the advance was measured in miles per day, not the dozens of miles per day that the plan required. And two towns were holding out against all German efforts to reduce them: Streetvith in the north and Bastogne in the south. Streetvith's defense bought the Allies precious time, but at a terrible cost. The town sat at a critical road junction, and the 7th Armoured Division, reinforced by remnants of other units, held it against overwhelming German pressure from December 17th through December 23rd. The defenders were surrounded, low on ammunition, and taking casualties. They couldn't evacuate. But every day they held was a day the German offensive couldn't use the roads through Streetvith, forcing panzers onto secondary routes that slowed the advance to a crawl. When the garrison finally abandoned Streetvith on December 23rd, they had delayed the German timetable by 6 days. Hitler's plan had called for Streetvith to fall on day one. The stubborn American defense there represented a victory in defeat, a pattern that would repeat across the entire Ardennes battlefield. German tactical successes were consistently purchased at a strategic price that couldn't be afforded. Time was bleeding away, fuel was running out, and American reinforcements were rushing toward the battlefield from every direction. December 18th also brought the moment when Allied High Command fully grasped the magnitude of the crisis. Eisenhower called an emergency conference at Verdun, the ancient fortress city that had symbolized French resistance in the previous war. The men who gathered in that cold stone room represented the Allied command structure. Eisenhower himself, Bradley commanding 12th Army Group, Patton commanding 3rd Army in the south, and various corps and army commanders. The maps showed a terrifying picture: a German penetration 40 miles deep and 30 miles wide, American units scattered and disorganized, critical road junctions threatened. The Meuse River bridges, the last barrier before open country leading to Antwerp, only 60 miles from the German spearheads. But Eisenhower's response was not panic, but cold calculation. This German offensive had overextended itself. The panzers were outrunning their supply lines. If the Allies could hold certain key points and rush reinforcements to the flanks, they could contain the breakthrough and then counterattack to destroy the German forces that had pushed so far into Allied lines. Eisenhower looked at Patton and asked the question that would define both men's historical legacies. "George, when can you attack?" Patton's answer shocked everyone in the room. "December 22nd, with 3 divisions." Bradley thought it was impossible. British commanders thought it was American bravado. Even Eisenhower seemed skeptical. To attack in 3 days meant turning Third Army 90 degrees, pulling divisions out of active combat in the Saar, moving them 100 miles north through winter weather on congested roads, and launching a coordinated offensive into the flank of the German penetration. It was the kind of operational maneuver that planning staffs needed weeks to organize. Patton was promising it in 72 hours. But what nobody in that room knew, except Patton and his chief of staff, was that Third Army had already been planning for exactly this contingency. For 2 weeks, even while attacking toward the Saar River, Patton's operations staff had been wargaming a German breakthrough in the Ardennes and developing plans to respond. They had 3 plans ready, codenamed Nickel, Penny, and Dime, each designed to shift Third Army north with 1, 2, or 3 corps. Patton had simply been waiting for permission to execute. What looked like impossible improvisation was actually careful preparation meeting opportunity. The human cost of the first 3 days of the German offensive defies easy summary, but certain statistics capture the scale of the disaster. The 106th Infantry Division lost 2 entire regiments, over 8,000 men, in the Schnee-Eifel encirclement. The 28th Infantry Division, already under strength from Hürtgen Forest, was shattered again and would require months to rebuild. Entire battalions simply vanished from American order of battle lists, their fates unknown for days. German losses were proportionally severe but less immediately crippling because they had expected heavy casualties in the breakthrough phase. But what German commanders hadn't expected was the sheer stubbornness of American resistance, the willingness of surrounded units to keep fighting rather than surrender, the aggressive use of artillery even by retreating forces. Every hour of delay cost the Germans fuel they couldn't replace and time they didn't have, and racing toward the centre of the entire battle, where 7 roads converged at a small Belgian market town, were 2 American airborne divisions pulled out of reserve in France and loaded onto trucks in the middle of the night. The race for Bastogne was about to begin. December 19th brought the clearest indication yet that the German offensive was failing despite tactical successes. Piper's Kampfgruppe, the spearhead of the entire northern thrust, was trapped and would eventually be forced to abandon all its vehicles and escape on foot. The 6th SS Panzer Army, which Hitler had counted on to make the decisive breakthrough because of ideological faith in SS fighting power, was completely stalled. Only Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army in the centre was still making progress, and even there the advance was slowing. The weather, which had favoured the Germans by grounding Allied air power, was about to change. Forecasters predicted clearing skies by December 23rd. Once American and British fighters and bombers could operate, the German columns packed onto narrow roads would be slaughtered from the air. The window for success was closing. And yet Hitler refused to authorize any change to the plan. Antwerp remained the objective. There would be no retreat, no adjustment, no flexibility. The German offensive would continue until it succeeded or destroyed itself in the attempt. For the American forces rushing north to contain the breakthrough, the question was whether they could arrive in time to prevent that success. The answer would be decided at Bastogne. December 17th, 1944. A staff officer at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, spreads a Michelin road map of Belgium across a conference table in Versailles. He's looking for Bastogne, a town he's never heard of, in a region he'd considered a military backwater until 48 hours ago. His finger traces the roads converging on that single point. 7 paved highways, radiating out like spokes from a hub, connecting every significant town and village in the southern Ardennes. For mechanized armies dependent on all-weather roads, especially in winter when cross-country movement meant bogging down in frozen mud, those 7 highways represented the only viable routes through the region. Hold Bastogne and German armour would be forced onto secondary roads barely adequate for trucks, let alone 70-ton King Tigers. Loose Bastogne and 5th Panzer Army would have an open highway to the Meuse River and beyond. The staff officer reaches for a red marker and circles the town. Within hours, orders will flow out from this headquarters that will transform an obscure Belgian crossroads into one of the most famous battlefields in American military history. Bastogne in mid-December 1944 was an ordinary town of about 4,000 inhabitants, most of them Walloon-speaking Belgians who had endured 4 years of German occupation and were just beginning to believe liberation might be permanent. The town featured a central square called Place McAuliffe, though it hadn't yet earned that name, and the usual amenities of a regional market centre, a church, a seminary, shops, and a hospital. What made Bastogne strategically vital was purely a matter of geography and infrastructure. The Ardennes region, for all its forested beauty, had remarkably few paved roads suitable for heavy military traffic. Most routes were narrow country lanes that became impassable quagmires the moment it rained or snowed. The 7 highways that met at Bastogne numbered N4, N15, N26, N30, N34, N85, and N874 in the Belgian system were the exceptions, properly paved, relatively straight, and engineered to modern standards. Controlling those highways meant controlling movement through the entire southern Ardennes. German planners had understood this from the beginning. 5th Panzer Army's route of advance had Bastogne as its initial objective, to be captured within 48 hours. After that, the panzers would fan out on those same highways, racing for the Meuse crossings at Dinant and Namur. The American response to the German offensive was hampered by confusion and communication failures, but one decision Eisenhower made almost immediately proved crucial. On December 17th, he released Shah F's Strategic Reserve, the only 2 divisions not committed to frontline sectors or occupation duties, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. These elite formations, veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, were resting in camps around Reims, France, refitting after their previous operations and expecting to spend Christmas away from combat. Instead, at midnight on the 17th, sergeants went through barracks shouting for soldiers to pack combat gear and board trucks waiting outside. Nobody knew where they were going. Rumours flew. Another airborne drop, a crisis at the front, maybe even a German breakthrough. The truth was worse than most rumours. They were going to the Ardennes to stop a panzer army, and they would be doing it without the heavy weapons and armour support that airborne divisions lacked by design. The race for Bastogne came down to a question of arrival times. German 5th Panzer Army's 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division were approaching from the east, having broken through American lines and scattered the defending units. American 8 Corps headquarters in Bastogne, under General Troy Middleton, was trying to organise a defence with whatever units could reach the town first. The nearest available American armour was Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division, detached from Patton's 3rd Army and sent north as one of the first reinforcements. On the morning of December 18th, CCB's 3 task forces, named after their commanders, Cherry, O'Hara, and Desaubry, began racing toward Bastogne through columns of retreating American infantry. They arrived with hours to spare, taking up positions east and northeast of town just as German reconnaissance elements were approaching. The tankers of CCB established a thin screen around Bastogne's perimeter, buying time for the real reinforcements to arrive. The 101st Airborne. The 101st Airborne's journey to Bastogne became legendary for the speed and determination with which it was executed. At 4 a.m. on December 18th, advance elements began boarding trucks for what would be a 107-mile movement through winter conditions. Most paratroopers wore only their standard jump uniforms, without the winter gear they'd need for a siege in sub-freezing temperatures. Ammunition supplies were limited, heavy weapons were scarce, artillery support would have to be improvised, but the division moved with the disciplined speed of elite troops who knew every minute counted. Through the day and into the night, truck convoys carrying 10,000 paratroopers rolled north, passing streams of refugees and retreating American units heading the opposite direction. The psychological impact on those retreating soldiers, seeing the screaming eagles heading toward the fight they were escaping, was immeasurable. Some men turned around and followed the airborne troops back to Bastogne, unwilling to be seen running while the paratroopers advanced. General Anthony McAuliffe, the 101st's artillery commander who found himself acting division commander because Major General Maxwell Taylor was in the United States, arrived in Bastogne on the evening of December 18th. What he found was barely controlled chaos. Middleton's 8th Corps headquarters was preparing to evacuate. Retreating American units were streaming through town. Belgian civilians were fleeing west, their possessions piled on carts and wagons, and to the east, German artillery was already within range, dropping shells on the outskirts of town. McAuliffe made a quick assessment of the situation and gave orders that would define the next week. Establish a circular defence around Bastogne, with the 101st holding the perimeter and CCB's armour providing mobile reserves. Every road into town would be defended, Nothing gets through. 8 Corps headquarters could evacuate if Middleton wished, but the 101st was staying. The decision was made with incomplete information and insufficient resources, but it was the right decision, because by December 20th, German forces had completely surrounded Bastogne, cutting all ground access, and the siege that would make the town famous had begun. The strategic importance of holding Bastogne cannot be overstated, and yet it almost didn't happen. If German forces had moved faster in the first 3 days, if CCB had arrived even a few hours later, if Eisenhower had hesitated before committing his strategic reserve, Bastogne would have fallen, and with it, the entire southern flank of the German offensive would have had the roads it needed. 5th Panzer Army could have raced west unimpeded, reaching the Meuse before American reinforcements from the south, meaning Patton's 3rd Army, could establish defensive positions. The northern and southern German thrusts might have linked up, trapping entire American divisions in a pocket that would dwarf the Schnee-Eifel disaster. Hitler's desperate gamble might have worked, forcing the Allies back to defensive positions they hadn't occupied since summer, buying Germany months of additional war-making time. All of this hinged on a single Belgian town that appeared on few maps, and whose name most Americans couldn't pronounce. December 20th brought the reality of encirclement. German forces, frustrated by their inability to simply push through Bastogne, began surrounding it instead. Panzer Lehr Division swung south of town. 2nd Panzer Division passed north. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division closed in from the east. By nightfall, no ground route in or out of Bastogne remained open. The garrison was completely isolated, dependent on air supply for everything from ammunition to medical supplies. McAuliffe's headquarters, set up in the Heinz barracks in town, began receiving reports from all sectors: German probing attacks, artillery bombardments, attempts to infiltrate the perimeter. The defenders were discovering what siege warfare meant in the 20th century. This wouldn't be a medieval investment with leisurely starvation. The Germans would assault continuously, testing every sector, looking for weak points. Artillery would fall day and night. Supplies would dwindle. Casualties would mount with no way to evacuate the wounded. And weather forecasts predicted continuing overcast, meaning no supply drops and no air support. The 101st Airborne was on its own. The population of Bastogne, military and civilian, faced the siege with grim determination mixed with genuine terror. The 4,000 Belgian civilians who remained in town, those who couldn't flee or chose to stay in their homes, crowded into cellars as artillery fire intensified. The town's hospital became overwhelmed within days, treating both American wounded and injured civilians in corridors and basement spaces. Food supplies for civilians ran short quickly. The American garrison, despite its own supply problems, shared rations with Belgian families, especially those with children. But the greatest shared burden was the constant shelling. German artillery, positioned in a complete ring around Bastogne, could hit any part of town at any time. There was no safe area, no place to rest without fear. Soldiers and civilians alike learned to recognize the sound of incoming fire, to distinguish between artillery and mortars, to take cover in the seconds between the whistle and the impact. Bastogne was becoming a hell of cold, fear, and random death. The siege of Bastogne also revealed the limitations of German operational planning. The original timetable had called for Bastogne to fall within 48 hours, allowing 5th Panzer Army to continue west unimpeded. Instead, by December 21st, 3 days after the initial attacks, Bastogne was still holding, and now it was surrounded, tying down German divisions that should have been racing for the Meuse. Hitler, furious at the delay, demanded that Bastogne be taken at any cost, but the units surrounding the town were discovering that reducing a determined defense required time, heavy weapons, and a willingness to accept casualties that the Wehrmacht could no longer afford. Meanwhile, those 7 highways radiating from Bastogne remained blocked. German columns were forced onto secondary roads, single-lane tracks through frozen forests where traffic jams stretched for miles. The offensive was losing momentum, not from American counterattacks, but from logistical strangulation. Bastogne was becoming Germany's Verdun, a position that acquired symbolic importance beyond its tactical value, a place where prestige demanded victory but reality delivered only casualties and delay. And somewhere to the south, George Patton's 3rd Army was completing its pivot north, preparing to attack toward Bastogne with a fury that would become legendary. December 18th, 1944, 10 p.m. General George Smith, Patton Jr., sits in his headquarters in Nancy, France, studying maps under the harsh light of a single bulb, knowing sleep won't come tonight. 48 hours ago, his Third Army was prosecuting a successful offensive into the Saar region, pushing toward Germany proper, on the verge of breaching the West Wall fortifications. Now everything has changed. Bradley's phone call this afternoon was brief. "George, the Germans have broken through in the Ardennes. We need Third Army to disengage and attack north." Patton's response was immediate, almost casual. Fine, we should open up and let them get all the way to Paris, then we can cut them off and chew them up." Bradley didn't laugh. The situation was desperate, not theoretical. And now Patton faces the most complex logistical challenge of his career, turning an entire army 90 degrees, moving 250,000 men and 133,000 vehicles through winter weather on congested roads, and attacking in 3 days. Not 3 weeks. 3 days. It is the kind of operational maneuver that should be impossible. Patton intends to make it look easy. Third Army's position on December 18th was both a disadvantage and a strange advantage. The disadvantage was obvious. Patton's forces were 70 to 100 miles south of Bastogne, fully committed to offensive operations in the Saar, with supply lines stretched east and south, not north. Pulling divisions out of active combat, turning them around, and moving them in the opposite direction while maintaining unit cohesion was a nightmare that would test every aspect of military logistics. The advantage was less obvious, but equally real. Third Army was the most aggressive, mobile-minded, and operationally flexible American formation in Europe. Patton had spent 2 years building a staff and a culture that emphasized speed, initiative, and the willingness to attempt the supposedly impossible. His operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, and his intelligence chief, Colonel Oscar Koch, were among the finest staff officers in the US Army. And critically, they had been expecting something like this to happen. The secret of Patton's 3-day promise was that he'd been planning for exactly this contingency since early December. Koch, the intelligence officer, had been warning for weeks that the Germans were capable of a spoiling attack or even a limited offensive in the Ardennes. Most intelligence officers dismissed such warnings. The Germans were too weak, too disorganized, too beaten, but Koch kept insisting, and Patton listened. On December 12th, 4 days before the German offensive began, Patton ordered his staff to develop contingency plans for disengaging from the Saar and attacking north into the German flank. 3 plans were drafted, codenamed Nickel, Penny, and Dime, each designed to move 1, 2, or 3 corps north depending on the severity of the situation. Staff officers worked out road routes, fuel requirements, artillery positioning, everything needed for a major redeployment. When Eisenhower asked on December 19th when Third Army could attack, Patton wasn't improvising. He was executing a plan that existed on paper, had been wargamed, and was ready to implement. What looked like genius was actually careful preparation meeting opportunity. The conference at Verdun on December 19th became one of the war's legendary command meetings, partly because of what was decided and partly because of how Patton behaved. Eisenhower opened by explaining the crisis. A massive German breakthrough, American forces scattered and retreating, the entire situation in doubt. He asked his commanders what they could do and when. Bradley suggested that First Army, fighting on the northern shoulder of the German penetration, could probably hold but couldn't counterattack soon. British commanders recommended caution, establishing defensive positions, letting the German offensive exhaust itself. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton, "When can you attack?" Patton's answer was delivered with his characteristic certainty, December 22nd, with 3 divisions. The room went silent. Bradley thought it was impossible. Even Eisenhower seemed skeptical, asking Patton not to be fatuous. But Patton wasn't joking. He explained that Third Army could disengage from the Saar, pull out 3 divisions, move them north, and attack in 72 hours. Eisenhower studied his subordinate's face, looking for doubt or bravado, and saw only calm confidence. "All right, George," he said. "Go ahead." The divisions Patton selected for the initial attack revealed his understanding of the mission's requirements. 4th Armoured Division would lead the way, the tip of the spear. Because it was Third Army's most aggressive and capable tank formation, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey and spearheaded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, Combat Command B. Behind them would come the 26th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit from Massachusetts that had been bloodied in previous fighting but still had the numbers and resilience needed for sustained operations. And the 80th Infantry Division, veterans of some of the hardest fighting in Lorraine, would provide additional punch. 3 Corps, commanded by Major General John Milliken, would control these divisions, attacking on a narrow front straight north toward Bastogne. On paper, it was simple: 3 divisions, 1 route, 1 objective. But the execution would require solving 1,000 logistical problems simultaneously, while winter weather, German resistance, and simple exhaustion fought against every step. The movement began on December 20th, and the scale of the operation staggers the imagination. 133,178 vehicles moving simultaneously, most of them on a single highway axis heading north. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks carrying infantry, artillery, prime movers, towing guns, fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, jeeps carrying staff officers, ambulances preparing for casualties that hadn't happened yet. The convoy stretched for miles, moving day and night, a river of steel flowing toward the sound of guns. At every crossroads, military police stood in the freezing cold, directing traffic with hand signals and flashlights, orchestrating the movement with split-second timing. A single breakdown, one vehicle stalling in the middle of the road, could back up traffic for miles. Maintenance crews followed the columns, performing emergency repairs on vehicles that broke down, cannibalizing parts from the unfixable to keep the others moving. It was organized chaos, a massive improvisation held together by discipline and the knowledge that men in Bastogne were dying while Third Army repositioned. The soldiers moving north had mixed feelings about what they were doing. Relief at leaving the grinding attritional warfare of the Saar, where every village cost casualties and gains were measured in hundreds of yards. Anxiety about what they were moving toward, the rumors of German panzers and surrounded American units, pride in being chosen for this mission, in belonging to Patton's army, in being the ones riding to the rescue, and cold, bone-deep, numbing cold that made every moment in an open vehicle a test of endurance. Temperatures dropped to 0 degrees Fahrenheit and below, wind chill made it worse. Soldiers bundled in every piece of clothing they owned, wrapped themselves in blankets, huddled together for warmth in the backs of trucks. Frostbite casualties began before the divisions even reached the battlefield. Fingers froze to metal surfaces, feet went numb in boots that weren't adequate for winter warfare. Men urinated on their hands to warm them, a desperate trick that provided seconds of relief before the cold returned. The movement was taking a physical toll before any enemy fire was encountered. Radio discipline collapsed almost immediately, and German intelligence benefited immensely. The plan called for strict radio silence, with communications conducted by courier and wire when possible, but the chaos of movement, units getting lost on unfamiliar roads in darkness, commanders needing instant information, all of it led to radio messages in the clear. German intercept stations heard everything: division identifications, objectives, routes of march, arrival times. Wehrmacht intelligence officers plotted American movements with remarkable accuracy, knowing exactly where Third Army would attack and with what forces. The surprise Patton hoped for never materialized. When 4th Armored Division finally launched its attack on December 22nd, German forces were waiting in prepared positions, ready for the American onslaught. The advantage of operational speed was partially negated by the loss of tactical surprise, one of many small failures that would make the relief of Bastogne far costlier than anticipated. December 21st brought both good news and bad. The good news was that the divisions were arriving at their jumping-off positions, more or less on schedule. 4th Armoured was in position around Arlon, Belgium. The 26th Infantry was closing up behind them. The 80th Infantry was still on the road but would arrive in time. Artillery battalions were setting up in positions where they could support the initial attacks. Supply trucks were shuttling forward with ammunition, fuel, and rations. The machinery of Third Army was functioning as Patton had promised. The bad news was that everyone was exhausted before the battle even started. Tankers who should have been sleeping were performing maintenance on vehicles damaged during the march. Infantry who needed rest were digging in, preparing defensive positions against possible German counterattacks. Staff officers worked through the night, coordinating the final details of the attack plan, and the weather was getting worse, not better. Fog settled over the Ardennes, reducing visibility to yards. Snow began falling, covering roads in ice. The predicted clearing that would allow air support was nowhere in sight. Patton's 3-day promise had been kept, but the real test was about to begin. The human dimension of Third Army's pivot often gets lost in the operational statistics. Each of those 133,000 vehicles contained soldiers who were individuals, not statistics, men with families and fears and futures they hoped to survive to see. A tank driver from Michigan who'd worked in an auto factory before the war, now driving a Sherman through Belgian darkness, hoping not to slide off an icy road. An infantry lieutenant from Texas writing a letter he might never finish, trying to explain to his parents what this all meant. A artillery forward observer from New York, a kid who'd never been outside Brooklyn before the army, now calculating firing coordinates for guns that would determine whether other Americans lived or died. These men were executing one of the most complex military operations of the war, and most of them didn't fully understand what they were part of. They knew Patton had ordered them north. They knew Americans were surrounded somewhere ahead. They knew they were going into a fight. That was enough. On December 22nd, Third Army attacked. December 20th, 1944, 4 a.m. Darkness covers the Belgian countryside, broken only by the blackout dim headlights of military vehicles stretching to the horizon. A sergeant in 4th Armoured Division stands beside the highway near Arlon, checking his watch, counting the tanks as they roll past. Sherman after Sherman, their 30-ton weight making the frozen ground tremble, the roar of 500 horsepower Ford engines drowning out all other sound. He's supposed to be counting, logging unit numbers, but he gives up after 50 tanks. The column has no end, he can see. Somewhere ahead is Bastogne, 22 miles north, where the 101st Airborne has been surrounded for 48 hours. Somewhere ahead is the largest concentration of German armour in the West, panzer divisions that broke through American lines and are now trying to reach the Meuse River. And between here and there is frozen Belgian farmland, forests, villages held by enemy forces, and roads that might be mined, blocked, or simply impassable. The sergeant climbs onto his own Sherman, slaps the turret twice to signal the crew, and feels the tank lurch forward. Third Army's relief of Bastogne has begun. The statistics of the pivot, impressive as they are, don't capture the grinding reality of moving a modern army through winter conditions. 133,178 vehicles, covering approximately 1.6 million vehicle miles in 72 hours. 4th Armoured Division travelled 101 miles from their positions in the Saar to the attack line near Arlon. 80th Infantry Division covered 107 miles. 26th Infantry Division moved 75 miles. But these are straight line distances. The actual routes, following available highways, adding detours around damaged bridges, accounting for traffic congestion, were far longer, and the speed of movement tells only part of the story. What matters more is that the divisions arrived at all, that they maintained organisational integrity, that they were ready to fight upon arrival. By any reasonable military standard, what Third Army accomplished should have taken a week of preparation. Patton did it in 3 days. The road junction at Arlon, Belgium, became one of the critical choke points of the entire operation, a place where Third Army's careful planning either would work or would collapse into gridlock. 3 highways converged at Arlon, the routes that 4th Armoured, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry needed to use to reach their attack positions. On the night of December 20th, all 3 divisions were trying to pass through this single crossroads simultaneously. A traffic accident here, one disabled vehicle blocking an intersection, could have paralysed the entire movement for hours. Instead, military police orchestrated the flow with flashlights and hand signals, directing each vehicle down the correct route, maintaining spacing, preventing collisions. A captain in the MP detachment later described it as conducting a symphony, except the orchestra consisted of thousands of vehicles driven by tired men in darkness on icy roads. One MP sergeant directed traffic for 18 consecutive hours, standing at an intersection in sub-freezing temperatures until he collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried away for medical treatment. His replacement took over without missing a beat. Inside the vehicles, soldiers experienced the movement as a combination of boredom, discomfort, and growing anxiety. Tank crews had the worst of it. A Sherman tank's interior in winter was a metal freezer, cold seeping through every surface, crew compartments unheated except for warmth radiating from the engine. Tankers wore every layer they could fit under their coveralls. Undershirts, wool shirts, field jackets, tanker jackets. Some wrapped themselves in blankets, others used empty sandbags as insulation. Their breath frosted in the air, condensed on metal surfaces, and froze into ice patterns on the inside of the turret. The driver, crammed into his position in the front hull, couldn't see much even with good visibility. In the darkness and fog of December, he drove by feel, following the blackout lights of the vehicle ahead, praying not to slide off the road or hit something. The crew commander, riding in the turret cupola, had an even more miserable position. He needed to be exposed, head out of the hatch, watching for obstacles and threats. The wind hit him with full force, wind chill dropping the effective temperature to 30 or 40 below zero. Commanders took turns in 15-minute shifts, all they could endure before frostbite became a danger. The maintenance crisis that developed during the movement revealed how hard Third Army had been pushing its equipment. 30% of vehicles required some form of repair upon reaching the assembly areas. Tanks threw tracks on icy roads, the rubber and steel failing in cold temperatures they weren't designed for, engines seized from inadequate oil viscosity in sub-zero conditions, transmissions failed from constant operation without proper maintenance intervals, half-tracks broke axles, trucks burned out clutches, artillery pieces arrived with damaged recall mechanisms from being towed too fast over rough roads. The ordnance companies worked miracles, cannibalizing parts from the most damaged vehicles to keep others operational, performing repairs in darkness by feel as much as sight, improvising solutions because proper parts weren't available. By December 22nd, when the attack began, 4th Armoured had 85% of its tanks operational, an achievement given the circumstances, but 25% below authorized strength. Every broken vehicle represented lost combat power, a tank or gun that wouldn't be available when the shooting started. The cold affected soldiers as much as equipment, and medical personnel began treating frostbite casualties before the divisions engaged the enemy. Frostbite is insidious, starting with numbness that makes the affected area feel almost warm, progressing to tissue damage that can require amputation if untreated. Soldiers whose boots got wet, either from snow or from stepping in icy water, were at highest risk. The dampness conducted heat away from feet faster than dry cold could. Within an hour, toes went numb. Within 2 hours, tissue damage began. The Army's winter boots, designed for stateside use, were inadequate for sustained operations in European winter conditions. Some units improvised, wrapping feet in extra socks, newspapers for insulation, even straw. Medical officers gave lectures on frostbite prevention, changed socks regularly, never warm frozen flesh too quickly, watch your buddy's face for the white patches that indicated facial frostbite. By the time Third Army engaged German forces, hundreds of soldiers were already casualties, never having fired a shot. Radio communications during the movement were supposed to follow strict protocols, minimal transmissions, encoded messages, radio silence whenever possible. The reality was chaos. Units got lost on unfamiliar roads and broke radio silence to ask for directions. Commanders needed to coordinate with adjacent units and transmit it in the clear. Traffic accidents required immediate reporting. The result was that German radio intercept stations heard everything. Wehrmacht intelligence officers plotted American movements with remarkable precision, identifying divisions, tracking their progress north, deducing their objectives. German commanders prepared accordingly. When 4th Armoured Division attacked north from Arlon on December 22nd, the German 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, 5th Parachute Division, was waiting in prepared defensive positions. The Germans knew 4th Armoured was coming, knew approximately when they'd arrive, and knew their objective was Bastogne. Radio discipline had broken down completely, trading operational security for tactical coordination. It was probably an unavoidable choice, given the circumstances, but it cost American lives in the battles to come. December 21st brought the final pieces of Third Army's deployment into place. Artillery battalions established firing positions where they could support the armoured advance. Forward observers moved up to positions where they could see German lines and call in fire. Infantry divisions moved into positions behind the armour, ready to exploit breakthroughs or hold gained ground. Supply dumps were established at Arlon and other forward locations, ammunition and fuel stockpiled for the coming battle. Medical companies set up aid stations, preparing for casualties that everyone knew would be heavy, and Patton himself moved his command post forward, closer to the action, where he could personally influence the battle. He visited each division before the attack, making speeches to assembled officers and men, delivering the mixture of profanity, patriotism, and blunt realism that his soldiers expected. "The Germans have stuck their head in a meat grinder," he told 4th Armoured, "and I've got hold of the handle." It was pure Patton, confident, aggressive, reducing complex strategy to a visceral metaphor his soldiers could understand. The aerial view of Third Army's deployment, had anyone been able to achieve it through the overcast, would have shown a remarkable sight. 3 arrows of American military power, converging on the base of the German penetration. From the west, First Army was finally stabilizing the northern shoulder of the Bulge, containing German forces around Street, 5th and Elsenborn. From the north, British XXX Corps was moving into blocking positions near the Meuse River, the last line of defence if German panzers broke through. And from the south, Third Army was forming up for the counterattack that would relieve Bastogne and begin the process of eliminating the entire German salient. Hitler's gamble was facing the inexorable reality of Allied material superiority. The Wehrmacht could achieve tactical surprise, could break through weakly held sectors, could advance dozens of miles, but it couldn't prevent the Allies from concentrating overwhelming force in response. The question now was whether that response would come quickly enough to save the garrison surrounded at Bastogne. The final hours before the attack were spent in preparation rituals that soldiers throughout history would recognize. Tank crews performed last-minute maintenance, checking track tension, oil levels, ammunition loads. Infantrymen cleaned weapons, wrote letters, tried to sleep in frozen foxholes. Medics checked their supplies, morphine syrettes that wouldn't freeze, bandages, plasma. Chaplains held services for those who wanted them, short prayers in the darkness, asking God's protection for what was to come. And everyone waited for the order to attack, knowing that the easy part was over. Moving north had been difficult, exhausting, cold. Fighting north would be worse. German forces were dug in, had artillery support, and were determined to hold. Every village, every crossroads, every bridge would be contested. The relief of Bastogne would be purchased with American blood, and everyone preparing to attack on December 22nd knew they might be part of the price. At 6 a.m., the artillery barrage began, and Third Army's offensive started. December 21st, 1944, dawn. A paratrooper from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment crouches in a foxhole on the eastern edge of Bastogne's perimeter, watching German infantry advance across a snow-covered field. He can see their breath in the cold air, can hear their officers shouting orders in a language he doesn't understand. He has 8 rounds left in his Mongarand, no grenades, and hasn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. Behind him, somewhere in the town, is the command post where General McAuliffe coordinates the defense. Around him, in a rough circle, maybe 4 miles in diameter, are 18,000 American soldiers who woke this morning to the reality that they are completely surrounded. Every road out of Bastogne is held by German forces. Every supply line is cut. The only connection to the outside world is radio, and the messages coming through are variations on the same theme. Hold on, help is coming, we don't know when. The paratrooper sights on the lead German soldier, exhales slowly, and squeezes the trigger. The siege of Bastogne has entered its critical phase. The German encirclement was completed methodically between December 19th and 21st, a textbook maneuver that should have led to the garrison's surrender within days. Panzer Division, commanded by Fritz Bayerlein, swung south of Bastogne and took up blocking positions on the roads toward Arlon, directly in the path of any relief force from Third Army. 2nd Panzer Division passed north of town, racing toward the Meuse River but leaving behind elements to close the circle. 26th Volksgrenadier Division approached from the east, the direction of the original German breakthrough, and various smaller formations filled the gaps, creating a perimeter that had no obvious weak points. The German forces surrounding Bastogne outnumbered the defenders, had more artillery, and possessed the initiative. By every conventional military calculation, the Americans should have either been overrun or forced to surrender. The fact that neither happened reveals both the quality of American defensive fighting and the limitations of German offensive capability. By December 1944, the composition of Bastogne's garrison was a mixture that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. The Corps was the 101st Airborne Division, elite paratroopers with extensive combat experience but lacking heavy weapons and designed for short-duration operations, not sustained defense. Supporting them was Combat Command B of 10th Armored Division, 3 task forces of tanks and armoured infantry that provided the mobile firepower airborne troops lacked, remnants of other units, survivors from formations shattered in the initial German breakthrough, added numbers if not always combat effectiveness. Artillery played a crucial role. 4 battalions of field artillery, including the 427th Glider Field Artillery and the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery, giving McAuliffe's force more artillery support than German commanders expected an isolated garrison to possess. The total came to about 18,000 men, a reinforced division, defending a perimeter that stretched too far for proper defensive density. The mathematics suggested failure. The reality proved different. December 22nd brought the incident that would make Bastogne legendary beyond its military significance. German officers approached American lines under a white flag, carrying an ultimatum from the commander of German forces surrounding the town. The message, typed in English, was addressed to the American commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, and offered terms: surrender within 2 hours, or face annihilation from German artillery and air forces. The ultimatum was delivered to McAuliffe's headquarters in the Heinz barracks, where the general was sleeping, exhausted from days of continuous operations. Staff officers woke him to read the German demand. McAuliffe's initial response was a single word, unprintable in family newspapers, but perfectly capturing the defender's attitude. When pressed to formulate an official reply, he struggled for words, and then settled on something that would work: nuts. His staff officers loved it. They typed up the one-word response and sent it back with the German officers, who seemed confused about whether it was an acceptance or refusal. An American officer explained, helpfully, "It means go to hell." The nuts reply became instant legend when reporters learned of it days later, but the reality of Bastogne's defense was far grimmer than the defiant humor suggested. Ammunition rationing began almost immediately after encirclement. Artillery battalions, which could have fired thousands of rounds per day in a normal defensive situation, were restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day. Forward observers called for fire missions only when absolutely necessary, when German attacks threatened to break through. Infantry received similar instructions: don't fire unless you have a target, make every shot count, conserve ammunition for the next attack. Soldiers scrounged ammunition from the dead, both American and German, collecting rifle rounds one at a time. Mortar crews husbanded their shells like misers. The result was a defense that looked weak on paper, unable to deliver the volume of fire doctrine called for, but worked in practice because every round was aimed, every shell placed exactly where it would do maximum damage. The medical situation deteriorated faster than ammunition supplies. Bastogne had one main aid station set up in the town's seminary building, and several smaller regimental aid posts scattered around the perimeter. By December 22nd, over 1,000 wounded crowded these facilities, far beyond their capacity. Doctors performed surgery in unheated rooms, their breath frosting in the air, working by flashlight and kerosene lamp. Medical supplies ran low: morphine, plasma, bandages, sulfur drugs. The wounded lay on floors covered only by blankets, often in pain that couldn't be adequately treated. Evacuation was impossible. Every wounded man remained in Bastogne, taking up space and resources the garrison couldn't spare. Doctors made triage decisions that haunted them for the rest of their lives: which men to treat first, which wounds could wait, who would die regardless of treatment. The seminary's chapel became a recovery ward: wounded men lying in pews, their blood staining the floorboards while medics moved among them, checking pulses and changing dressings. Outside, German artillery continued falling, adding to the casualty list hour by hour. December 23rd brought the first break in the weather, and with it the most beautiful sight Bastogne's defenders had ever seen. C-47 transport planes, dozens of them, flying over the town at low altitude, while German anti-aircraft guns fired desperately. The supply drop had been planned for days, but required clear weather. When the skies finally opened, the 9th Air Force committed every available transport to keeping Bastogne supplied. The first planes arrived mid-morning, flying at altitudes between 500 and 1,000 feet, low enough to ensure accurate drops, but high enough to avoid small arms fire. Coloured parachutes blossomed in the sky: red for ammunition, white for medical supplies, yellow for rations, blue for gasoline. The paratroopers on the ground, watching supplies drift down, felt hope for the first time in days. But the drops weren't perfect. Some supplies landed outside the perimeter and were captured by Germans. Parachutes failed to deploy, containers hit frozen ground and broke open, scattering their contents. Recovery teams raced across open ground under fire to retrieve what they could. By day's end, approximately 90 tons of supplies had been delivered, but only about 80% was recovered. It was enough to keep fighting, not enough to end the supply crisis. The Christmas Eve attack on the Champs sector revealed how close Bastogne came to being overrun. German forces concentrated elements of 2 divisions for a night assault on the northwest portion of the perimeter, defended by the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The attack came by moonlight, German infantry supported by armour, hitting a sector where American defences were thin. For hours, the fighting was hand-to-hand, Americans and Germans killing each other in frozen foxholes, with rifles, bayonets, grenades, and fists. The 327th held, but barely. By dawn on Christmas Day, the regiment had taken 50% casualties in some companies. The defensive line was intact but so fragile that another attack might have shattered it. German commanders, unaware how close they'd come to success, pulled back to reorganize. The opportunity passed. But the message was clear. Bastogne's perimeter could be broken. It was holding through determination and luck, not overwhelming strength. Christmas Day 1944 was the grimmest holiday most defenders had ever experienced. Some units tried to maintain traditions, holding brief religious services in frozen foxholes, sharing whatever extra rations they had saved. The German artillery gave them a Christmas present: intensified bombardment, shells falling on every sector of town, a reminder that the enemy surrounding them had not developed any seasonal generosity. In the seminary hospital, doctors worked through Christmas Day the same as any other day, treating wounded who kept arriving from every sector. Chaplains moved among the injured, offering what comfort they could to men who were facing either crippling wounds or slow deaths from wounds that couldn't be properly treated. Belgian civilians, those who remained in town, shared their last food with American soldiers, a gesture of solidarity that meant more than the meagre rations provided. Outside the perimeter, German loudspeakers played Christmas carols in both languages, a psychological warfare tactic designed to make American soldiers think of home, of families they might never see again. Some paratroopers found it affecting, others found it enraging. All of them kept fighting. The psychological state of Bastogne's defenders by late December was a strange mixture of determination, exhaustion, and growing anger. They were determined to hold because surrender was unthinkable, because they were elite troops, because their identity as soldiers demanded it. They were exhausted from constant combat, inadequate sleep, cold that sapped strength, and the stress of knowing they were completely isolated. And they were angry at the Germans for surrounding them, at higher command for leaving them in this situation, at the weather that kept air support grounded for days, at the world that had put them in a frozen Belgian town, facing death from all directions. This anger sustained them. Paratroopers who might have broken under pure defensive pressure instead found energy in rage, a determination to make the Germans pay for every yard, to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible before being killed themselves. It wasn't noble or glorious. It was the ugly reality of combat, the emotion that keeps men fighting when all rational calculation says they should quit. The question by December 25th was how much longer the garrison could hold. Ammunition was critically low despite the airdrops. Food supplies were inadequate, medical facilities were overwhelmed. The perimeter had held against multiple German assaults, but each attack cost casualties that couldn't be replaced. American artillery was down to emergency reserves, perhaps enough for one more major barrage. If the Germans launched another coordinated assault like Christmas Eve's attack, but across multiple sectors simultaneously, the perimeter might collapse. Everyone in Bastogne, from McAuliffe in his headquarters to privates in their foxholes, understood that relief had to come soon or wouldn't come at all. Radio messages from the outside promised that Third Army was attacking, that Patton's forces were fighting toward town, that relief was coming, but nobody in Bastogne knew how far away that relief was, how hard the fighting would be, or whether it would arrive in time. They knew only that they had to hold one more day, and then another after that. The mathematics of siege warfare were inexorable. Bastogne was dying by degrees. The only question was whether it would die completely before help arrived. December 22nd, 1944, 6 a.m. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Williams Abrams Jr. sits in the turret of his command tank, watching artillery fire land on German positions north of Arlon. He's 30 years old, a West Point graduate who looks older than his age, with a reputation throughout 4th Armoured Division as the most aggressive combat commander in an army full of aggressive commanders. His Combat Command B consists of roughly 4,000 men and 50 tanks, the spearhead of 3rd Army's relief operation. The mission is simple to state, impossible to execute. Attack north 22 miles to Bastogne, break through whatever German forces are in the way, and relieve the surrounded garrison. Abrams has been given 3 days to accomplish what should take 3 weeks. He intends to do it in 2. When the artillery barrage lifts, he'll lead his command into a meat grinder of German defensive positions, minefields, roadblocks, and panzer counterattacks. Men will die, tanks will burn, and nothing will stop unless he personally orders a halt. That's fine with Abrams. He doesn't plan to order any halts. 4th Armoured Division was 3rd Army's premier armoured formation, a division with a reputation earned through months of continuous combat across France and into the German border. Commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, the division was organised into 3 combat commands: Combat Command A, Combat Command B, and Combat Command Reserve, each a self-contained combined arms team of tanks, armoured infantry, artillery, and engineers. For the relief of Bastogne, Gaffey chose to attack on 3 routes simultaneously. Combat Command A, under Lieutenant Colonel Hunter, would take the western route through Vaux-les-Rosières. Combat Command Reserve, under Colonel Wendell Blanchard, would advance on the eastern route. And Abrams' Combat Command B would drive straight up the middle, the main effort, the force expected to reach Bastogne first. The plan assumed that at least one of these thrusts would break through German defences. What it didn't account for was that German forces knew the Americans were coming and had prepared accordingly. The first obstacle came within hours: the town of Martelange. Sitting astride the main highway to Bastogne, German forces had demolished the bridge over the Shore River and established defensive positions on the far bank. Abrams arrived to find the bridge, a twisted wreck of steel and concrete, the river 40 feet wide and too deep to ford, and German artillery zeroed on the crossing site. His engineers estimated 12 to 18 hours to construct a new bridge under fire. Abrams gave them 6. He positioned his tanks to provide covering fire, ordered artillery to suppress German positions, and watched his engineers work in conditions that violated every safety protocol. Men worked in freezing water, moving beams and decking while German shells exploded around them. Welders operated in the open, their torches visible to enemy observers. 3 engineers were killed by sniper fire. 2 more were wounded by artillery. But by midnight on December 22nd, a new bridge stood where the old one had been destroyed. Combat Command B rolled across and continued north. The 12-hour delay at Martelange set a pattern that would repeat for the next 4 days. German defenders couldn't stop 4th Armoured, but they could slow it, bleed it, make every mile cost casualties. December 23rd brought the first significant tank engagement, and with it the brutal reality of armoured warfare in winter conditions. Abrams' lead task force, commanded by Captain William Dwight, encountered German forces dug in around the village of Vernon. The engagement started with American Shermans trading shots with German assault guns at ranges where neither side had decisive advantage. A Sherman 75mm gun could penetrate German armour if it hit the right spot at the right angle. German 88mm guns could penetrate a Sherman from almost any angle. The mathematics favoured the Germans, but numbers favoured the Americans. For every German tank, 4th Armoured could field 3 or 4 Shermans. The tactic was simple and brutal. Advance until hit, have other Shermans continue forward, overwhelm German positions through sheer volume of fire. It worked, but it cost. By the end of the day's fighting, Combat Command B had lost 9 tanks destroyed, another dozen damaged, and approximately 50 men killed or wounded. The advance had covered 3 miles. Abrams' leadership style during the attack became legendary throughout 3rd Army. He led from the front, his command tank often in the lead position, personally directing fire and movement. When subordinate commanders reported obstacles, Abrams had a standard response: bypass them. If a German position was blocking one road, find another road. If all roads were blocked, go cross-country. If terrain prevented cross-country movement, attack directly and kill everything that resisted. His radio calls to division headquarters revealed growing frustration with the pace of advance. There is too much piddling around. We're supposed to be the relief force, not a sightseeing tour. When Gaffey urged caution to preserve force, Abrams replied that the only way to preserve force was to reach Bastogne before the garrison was overrun. Speed was protection. Hesitation was death. The philosophy was quintessentially American armor doctrine. Patton's aggressive spirit filtered through a battalion commander who believed every word of it. December 24th brought winter weather that turned the battlefield into a frozen hell. Temperatures dropped below zero, fog reduced visibility to less than 100 yards, and snow began falling in earnest. The conditions affected both sides equally, but they hit attacking forces harder than defenders. Shermans advancing through snow-covered fields presented perfect targets, dark shapes against white background, visible to German gunners, even through the fog. American infantry, riding in open-top half-tracks, suffered from exposure as much as enemy fire. Frostbite casualties equaled combat casualties in some units. Tank crews found that hydraulic fluids thickened in the cold, making turret traverse sluggish. Engines required extended warm-up periods before operating reliably. Machine guns jammed from frozen lubricants. Artillery pieces had reduced range because propellant burned at lower temperatures. Every mechanical system was pushed to its limits, and yet Combat Command B continued attacking because stopping meant the men in Bastogne died. The village of Bougainville became the scene of one of the most intense small unit actions of the entire relief operation. German forces had converted the stone buildings into miniature fortresses, positioning anti-tank guns to cover the single street that 4th Armoured needed to use. Abrams' solution was medieval in its directness: drive tanks down the street, accept casualties, and destroy every building that fired back. The street fight lasted 3 hours, Shermans and German anti-tank guns trading shots at ranges measured in yards. Buildings caught fire from tracer rounds, their interiors becoming ovens that killed defenders who didn't evacuate. Civilians, trapped in cellars, huddled terrified while the battle raged overhead. By the time Bougainville was secure, 5 American tanks had been destroyed, 2 more damaged beyond repair, and approximately 30 soldiers killed. The Germans lost more, but the tactical exchange rate favored the defense. Every mile toward Bastogne was paid for in blood and steel. Christmas Day brought one of the war's many small ironies: Americans and Germans fighting each other with particular intensity on the day both sides theoretically celebrated peace on Earth. 4th Armoured Division launched coordinated attacks across all 3 routes, hoping that simultaneous pressure would crack German defences. Combat Command A made marginal progress on the western route. Combat Command Reserve was stalled on the eastern approach, and Abrams CCB was grinding forward through Chaumont and Rameuil-Fossé, fighting for every crossroads, every bridge, every village. German resistance was fanatical. 5th Fallschirm Jäger Division, proving that Luftwaffe ground forces could fight as tenaciously as any Wehrmacht formation. The Germans were helped by terrain that favoured defence: narrow valleys, forested ridges that provided cover, villages built of stone that couldn't be easily destroyed. By day's end, Combat Command B had advanced another 3 miles, bringing Bastogne within 9 miles. It might as well have been 90. 9 miles of winter terrain, defended by experienced German troops with adequate artillery support, could take days to cross. December 26th dawned with Patton personally driving to 4th Armoured Division headquarters, furious at the pace of advance. Gaffey's division was supposed to have relieved Bastogne days ago. Instead, it was bogged down, short of the objective, taking casualties, making minimal progress. Patton arrived at Gaffey's command post in a rage, demanding explanations, threatening reliefs, doing what Patton did best: applying pressure that converted strategic urgency into tactical aggression. His message was simple: Bastogne must be relieved today. Not tomorrow, today. Find a way, break through, accept casualties, but get into that town. Gaffey passed the pressure down to his combat commanders. Abrams, who needed no encouragement to attack, received orders to make one more push, commit everything, reach Bastogne by nightfall. The mission was probably impossible. Abrams intended to accomplish it anyway. The final push on December 26th revealed both the capabilities and limitations of American armoured warfare. Abrams concentrated his remaining effective force, perhaps 15 tanks and 200 infantry, in half-tracks, for a direct assault on the village of Assenois, the last significant obstacle before Bastogne's perimeter. The attack plan abandoned all subtlety. Smash straight through. Don't stop for anything. Keep moving until you reach American lines. German forces in Assenois fought desperately, knowing this was the decisive moment. American tanks fired on the move. Infantry sprayed machine gun fire from their half-tracks. Artillery pounded German positions, seconds ahead of the armoured column. The village became a slaughterhouse, Germans and Americans killing each other at close range, vehicles exploding, buildings collapsing, civilians dying in the crossfire. And then Abrams' lead tanks were through, racing down the road toward Bastogne, bypassing German positions that hadn't been cleared, gambling that speed would carry them to the objective before German forces could react. It was the kind of desperate attack that should have failed. Somehow, impossibly, it succeeded. December 25th, 1944, evening. All 3 of 4th Armoured Division's combat commands sit stalled within 5 miles of Bastogne, close enough to hear the artillery fire falling on the town, too far to provide relief. Combat Command Reserve on the eastern route has been stopped cold by determined German resistance around Bougainville. Combat Command A on the western approach is tangled in fighting near Vaux-les-Rosières, making meters of progress measured in American casualties. And Abrams' Combat Command B, the spearhead that was supposed to break through days ago, holds positions around Clochemont, having lost a third of its effective tank strength. Getting there, inside Bastogne, the garrison is dying by degrees. Artillery, cold, and inadequate supplies, bleeding away combat power. Radio messages between 4th Armoured and Bastogne's defenders have taken on a desperate quality. How soon can you get here? Soon as possible, define soon as we can. The last 5 miles to Bastogne will prove harder than the first 17. The tactical situation on Christmas night revealed everything wrong with the relief operation. 4th Armoured Division was attacking on 3 separate routes, dividing its strength, unable to concentrate overwhelming force on any single axis. German defenders, though outnumbered overall, could concentrate locally against each American thrust, achieving numerical superiority at the point of contact. The terrain favoured defence. Villages provided strong points, forests concealed German positions, narrow roads prevented American armour from deploying off the highways. Weather continued to be miserable, fog and snow limiting visibility, preventing effective air support, and perhaps most critically, 4th Armoured had been attacking continuously for 4 days, taking casualties that reduced combat effectiveness with each engagement. Tank crews were exhausted, many having slept only a few hours in the past 96. Infantry was depleted, some companies reduced to half strength. Artillery had fired thousands of rounds, depleting ammunition stocks. The division needed rest and resupply. Instead, it got orders to attack again at dawn. Patton's visit to 4th Armoured Division headquarters on December 26 was both motivational and threatening. He arrived in his command vehicle, climbed out with his ivory-handled pistols visible, and demanded to see Gaffey immediately. The conversation, witnessed by multiple staff officers, was vintage profane, direct, alternating between inspiration and intimidation. He told Gaffey that Bastogne had to be relieved today, that Third Army's reputation depended on it, that American soldiers were dying every hour the relief was delayed. He reminded everyone present that they were supposed to be the best armoured division in Europe, that they'd bragged about their aggressive spirit, and now it was time to prove it. Then he left, driving forward to visit Abrams personally, because Patton recognised that Combat Command B was the formation most likely to achieve breakthrough. The message he delivered to Abrams was simpler: get into Bastogne today, I don't care how, I don't care what it costs, get there. The dawn attack on December 26 began with the heaviest artillery preparation 4th Armoured Division had yet delivered. Every available gun, plus attached corps artillery, fired on German positions around Assenoir and along the final approach to Bastogne. For 30 minutes, high explosive and white phosphorus shells tore apart German defensive positions. The barrage was designed to accomplish 2 objectives: suppress German defenders long enough for American armour to close, and demoralise German soldiers who had already endured days of combat. It achieved neither completely. German forces had survived months of Russian artillery barrages on the Eastern Front. This American bombardment, though intense by Western Front standards, was something they'd learned to endure. When the shelling stopped, German soldiers emerged from cellars and foxholes, manned their weapons, and prepared to fight. They knew what was coming. Abrams' plan for the final assault abandoned all caution. He would concentrate every operational tank, approximately 10 Shermans, into a single armoured fist. Behind the tanks would come a company of armoured infantry in half-tracks, 240 men, whose job was to suppress German infantry while the tanks dealt with anti-tank weapons. The force would smash straight through Assenoir, ignoring anything that wasn't blocking the road, and continue directly to Bastogne's perimeter. Units following behind would clear the village and secure the corridor, but the lead elements would not stop, would not divert to side objectives, would not slow down until they linked up with the 101st Airborne. It was a plan that violated doctrine, risked the assault force being cut off, and depended on speed and violence to succeed where proper tactics might fail. Abrams climbed into his command tank, radioed, "Let's go," and led the attack personally. The assault on Assenoir was over in 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes contained some of the most intense close combat of the European war. American tanks entered the village firing on the move, machine guns and main guns blazing at any building that might conceal German soldiers. The half-tracks followed infantry firing from their vehicles, not dismounting, maintaining speed. German anti-tank guns engaged at point-blank range, destroying lead tanks that blocked the street. Following tanks pushed the burning wrecks aside and continued forward. A German assault gun positioned behind a stone wall knocked out 2 Shermans before being destroyed by a third tank firing at 10 yards range. German infantry emerged from buildings with Panzerfausts, the disposable anti-tank rockets that could destroy a Sherman from any angle. American infantry shot them before they could fire. Buildings collapsed from tank fire. Civilians trapped in cellars screamed, and the American column kept moving, breaking through the eastern edge of Assenoir, leaving the village burning behind them. The 4-mile race from Assenoir to Bastogne's perimeter was the longest short distance any of the surviving tankers would ever experience. The road was open, German forces having concentrated in the villages rather than establishing positions in open country, but that didn't mean the route was safe. German artillery, recognizing what was happening, began shelling the road. Abrams' column accelerated, Shermans racing at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour, bouncing over frozen ruts, risking thrown tracks for the sake of speed. Infantry in the half-tracks held on desperately, men thrown around inside the vehicles, praying they wouldn't hit a mine. The column stretched out, faster tanks pulling ahead, slower vehicles falling behind. Abrams' command tank was in the lead. And as it crested a small rise, the crew could see Bastogne in the distance. A smudge of buildings, smoke from artillery impacts, and most importantly, American troops in foxholes along the perimeter. 4:45 p.m., December 26, 1944. First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the lead tank in Abrams' column, sees American helmets in foxholes ahead. He's not certain whether they're friendly or German, whether his tank is about to be destroyed by the very soldiers he's trying to rescue. He grabs his radio microphone and transmits in the clear, violating every radio security protocol. "Come here. This is the 4th Armoured." The response crackles back immediately. "We're from the 101st. Glad to see you." Boggess's tank breaks through the perimeter at the village of Assenoir, crews and paratroopers staring at each other in disbelief. The siege of Bastogne is broken. Relief has arrived. But the celebration is brief and muted, because everyone on both sides understands that relief doesn't mean safety. The corridor is 1 tank wide, under German artillery fire, and surrounded by enemy forces that will do everything possible to cut it. The immediate aftermath of link-up was chaos mixed with desperate logistics. Wounded from Bastogne began evacuating through the corridor, even as ammunition and medical supplies moved in the opposite direction. The road became a 2-way traffic jam, vehicles trying to pass each other on a highway barely wide enough for 1 tank. German artillery pounded the route, trying to cut the corridor before it could be widened and secured. Engineers moved up to clear mines and repair damaged pavement. Infantry from following units spread out on both sides of the road, establishing defensive positions against expected German counterattacks. Medical personnel from 4th Armoured entered Bastogne and were appalled by what they found. Hundreds of wounded lying in inadequate facilities, soldiers with frostbite injuries that should have been treated days earlier, doctors who'd been performing surgery continuously for a week. The relief had come, but it had come almost too late. Patton's entrance into Bastogne on December 27th was carefully stage-managed for its symbolic value. He arrived in his command vehicle, immaculately dressed despite the conditions, every bit the conquering general. His meeting with McAuliffe was brief and famous. "How are you, boy?" Patton asked. McAuliffe, exhausted and filthy from a week of siege warfare, replied simply, "Gee, I'm mighty glad to see you." Photographers captured the handshake, the image that would appear in newspapers across America. But away from the cameras, Patton's assessment was grimmer. The corridor was fragile, barely a quarter-mile wide at its narrowest point. German forces surrounded it on both sides. The garrison, though relieved, was exhausted and depleted. 4th Armoured Division had suffered over 1,000 casualties getting here, and the battle for Bastogne was far from over. Relief meant the siege had lifted. It didn't mean the fighting had stopped. The cost of the relief operation was measured in destroyed tanks and dead soldiers scattered along 22 miles of Belgian countryside. 4th Armoured Division had lost 31 tanks destroyed, another 40 damaged, in 4 days of combat. Casualties totaled over 1,000 men, 200 killed, 600 wounded, and approximately 200 missing or captured. The division had accomplished its mission but was no longer capable of sustained defensive operations. Combat Command B, Abrams's formation that broke through to Bastogne, was reduced to 15 operational tanks from the 50 it had started with. Infantry companies were at half strength, artillery battalions had expended most of their ammunition. The relief force needed relief itself, but there was no time for rest, no pause for reconstitution, because German forces were already preparing counterattacks to cut the corridor and re-isolate Bastogne. The battle was entering a new phase, one that would prove even more costly than the relief operation itself. The soldiers who made the link-up, both relievers and relieved, experienced a strange emotional complexity that photographs couldn't capture. There was relief that the siege had been broken, that supplies could now enter, that wounded could be evacuated. There was pride in having accomplished something difficult against heavy odds. But there was also exhaustion that went beyond the physical, a bone-deep weariness that came from days of continuous combat in winter conditions. There was grief for friends who hadn't survived to see the relief, and there was apprehension about what came next, because everyone understood that breaking the siege was only the first step. Holding the corridor, widening it, and ultimately defeating the German forces around Bastogne would require more fighting, more casualties, more sacrifice. The young private from Iowa who died on December 16th had been one of tens of thousands of casualties the Battle of the Bulge would claim. His death in the war's opening moments was tragic, but it wasn't unique, and the battle that had killed him was far from finished. December 26th, 1944, 4:45 p.m., Lieutenant Charles Boggess climbs out of his tank commander's position, boots hitting frozen Belgian ground, legs unsteady after hours in the vehicle. 50 yards ahead, paratroopers from the 101st Airborne are emerging from their foxholes, moving toward him with the slow, careful movements of men who've been living underground for a week. Boggess walks forward to meet them, hand extended, trying to think of something appropriate to say, and finding that words fail completely. A staff officer from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment shakes his hand, grips it hard enough to hurt, and says simply, "We knew you'd come." Boggess looks at the man's face, unshaven, eyes sunken from exhaustion and inadequate sleep, uniform filthy with a week's accumulation of dirt and blood. Behind the paratrooper, he can see Bastogne, buildings damaged by artillery, smoke rising from multiple fires, the physical evidence of a town that's been under siege. The handshake lasts 5 seconds. It represents the end of one battle and the beginning of another. The tactical reality of the relief was far less dramatic than the emotional moment. What Boggess and Abrams had achieved was creating a corridor, not establishing secure communications. The route from Assenoise to Bastogne was barely more than a dirt road, pocked with shell craters, wide enough for one vehicle in most places. German forces held positions on both sides, near enough to hit the road with small arms fire in some sectors. Artillery had the entire route registered, meaning shells could arrive within seconds of a fire mission being called. Nothing could move on that road without coming under fire. And yet, everything that Bastogne needed had to come through that single route. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, fuel, replacements. The corridor was a lifeline, but it was the most dangerous lifeline imaginable, what soldiers immediately began calling Purple Heart Lane for the casualties anyone using it was likely to take. The first priority was evacuating wounded, and the process began even as the link-up was occurring. Ambulances and trucks designated for medical evacuation rolled through the corridor into Bastogne, where medics had been triaging casualties for this moment. The most seriously wounded went first, men who would die without surgery that Bastogne's overwhelmed medical facilities couldn't provide. Stretcher bearers carried them from the seminary hospital to waiting vehicles, while German artillery fell randomly across town. Some wounded died during evacuation, killed by the same artillery they'd survived for days inside the perimeter. Others made it through the corridor only to die from wounds that had gone too long without proper treatment. The doctors who'd kept them alive through the siege watched them go with mixed emotions. Relief that proper medical care was now possible, guilt that it had taken so long, grief for those who wouldn't survive despite everything. By midnight on December 26th, 652 wounded had been evacuated, another 400 remained, too injured to move or too stable to require immediate evacuation. Bringing supplies into Bastogne was equally chaotic and dangerous. Ammunition trucks rolled in first, because the garrison's artillery was down to emergency reserves. Artillerymen formed human chains, passing shells from trucks to stockpiles, working with desperate speed because staying stationary made them artillery targets. Food came next, rations that seemed luxurious after a week of siege diet. Canned meat, bread, coffee, cigarettes. Fuel trucks followed, essential for keeping vehicles operational in sub-zero temperatures. Medical supplies came in, ambulances, loaded with plasma, morphine, bandages, and the sulfur drugs that prevented infection. Each convoy ran the gauntlet of German fire, and each convoy took casualties. Drivers learned to accelerate through certain stretches where German gunners had perfect fields of fire, racing at speeds that risked losing control on icy roads. Calculating that speed was their only protection. Some trucks didn't make it, destroyed by artillery or knocked out by anti-tank fire. Their loads were recovered by salvage teams and brought in on the next convoy. The psychological impact of relief on Bastogne's defenders varied depending on how they'd experienced the siege. Some soldiers felt overwhelming relief, the release of tension they'd been carrying for days, manifest in shaking hands and uncontrollable emotion. Others felt nothing, too exhausted or too traumatized to process what relief meant. A few felt disappointment that they hadn't been able to break out themselves, that salvation had come from outside rather than through their own efforts. And many felt a strange deflation, the letdown that comes when intense stress suddenly ends. For a week they'd had one objective: survive until relief arrived. Now relief was here, and they didn't know what came next. The paratroopers who'd fought at Normandy and Market Garden recognized the feeling. Combat created a terrible clarity, reducing life to simple objectives: kill the enemy, protect your buddies, stay alive. When combat paused, even briefly, that clarity dissolved, leaving soldiers adrift in uncertainty. December 27th brought the reality check that relief hadn't ended the danger. German forces, having failed to prevent 4th Armoured from reaching Bastogne, now attempted to cut the corridor and re-establish the siege. Artillery fire on the Assenois route intensified. German infantry probed both sides of the corridor, looking for weak points to exploit. Panzer elements, pulled from other sectors, moved into positions from which they could attack the corridor's flanks. The American response required every available unit. 4th Armoured Division's following elements, which had been expected to rest after the relief operation, instead found themselves fighting defensive battles to widen and secure the corridor. The 101st Airborne, exhausted from a week of siege, had to maintain defensive positions on Bastogne's perimeter because German forces surrounding the town hadn't withdrawn, and additional divisions were being rushed forward. 35th Infantry Division from 3rd Army Reserve, 87th Infantry Division from 9th Army, 11th Armoured Division from Patton's Mobile Reserve, all converging on Bastogne because the corridor had to be held. The meeting between Patton and McAuliffe on December 27th was both a photo opportunity and a genuine strategic conference. Patton needed to understand the garrison's condition, what combat power remained, what supplies were critical, how long before the 101st could resume offensive operations. McAuliffe's answers were sobering. The division had taken approximately 2,000 casualties, about 11% of its strength. More importantly, it had lost most of its officers and NCOs in certain units, the experienced leaders, who made the division effective. Ammunition stocks were adequate for defensive operations, but insufficient for attacks. Soldiers needed rest, hot food, and winter equipment they'd been without for a week. The division could hold Bastogne indefinitely, but it couldn't attack out of the perimeter without reinforcement and resupply. Patton absorbed the information, asked sharp questions about German dispositions and capabilities, and made a decision. The 101st would remain in Bastogne as garrison, while fresh divisions would widen the corridor and begin the process of eliminating the German salient. The civilians of Bastogne emerged from their cellars on December 27th to find their town transformed. Buildings that had stood for centuries were damaged or destroyed. The central square was cratered from artillery impacts. Bodies, both American and German, lay in streets where they'd fallen during fighting. Unexploded ordnance littered the town, shells that had buried themselves in frozen ground without detonating. The population that had welcomed American liberators in September now viewed them with more complex emotions: gratitude for defense against German recapture, anger at the destruction the battle had caused, fear about what would happen if Germans counterattacked successfully. Belgian civilians began the grim work of burying their dead, repairing what could be repaired, and trying to restore some semblance of normal life to a town that had become a battlefield. The tactical geography of Bastogne after relief was radically different from before. Previously, the town had been an isolated island, completely surrounded, dependent on airdrops. Now it was a peninsula connected to American lines by a narrow corridor but still threatened on three sides. German forces held the high ground east, north, and west of town. Their artillery could still hit any part of Bastogne at will. The roads radiating out from town, those 7 highways that made Bastogne strategically important, were all either blocked by German positions or under such heavy fire that using them was suicidal. The relief had changed Bastogne's status from besieged to threatened. That was progress, but it was far from victory. True relief, the kind that allowed normal operations, required widening the corridor to miles rather than yards, pushing German forces back beyond artillery range, and securing the road network. That would take weeks and cost thousands more casualties. The soldiers of 4th Armoured Division who broke through to Bastogne found themselves minor celebrities among the garrison they'd relieved, but the attention was awkward and often unwanted. Paratroopers treated tankers with a mixture of gratitude and the natural rivalry between elite units. "Took you long enough" was a common greeting, delivered with smiles that didn't entirely remove the sting. The tankers, for their part, resented the implication that the relief had been easy or delayed unnecessarily. They'd fought 22 miles in 4 days, lost a third of their tanks, and suffered over 1,000 casualties. The gap between public perception, relief as a triumphant moment, and soldier reality, relief as just another hard fight, was immense. But soldiers on both sides recognized a shared truth. They'd accomplished something difficult together. Relievers and relieved, tankers and paratroopers, and they'd done it in winter conditions against an enemy that fought well and hard. That was enough for mutual respect, even if it wasn't enough for the kind of glory newspaper readers back home imagined. The question on December 27th, asked by soldiers in Bastogne and commanders in rear areas, was what came next. The siege was broken, but the Battle of the Bulge continued. German forces still held a massive salient, 60 miles deep and 30 miles wide, containing most of 5th Panzer Army and elements of 6th SS Panzer Army. Hitler was refusing to authorize withdrawal, demanding that the offensive continue until Antwerp fell or the Wehrmacht was destroyed trying. Allied forces were converging from north and south, preparing to eliminate the salient through coordinated counter-offensives. Bastogne, which had been the center of the battle, was becoming one front among many. For the soldiers who'd fought there, this should have been good news. The spotlight was moving elsewhere, but they understood that moving spotlight meant the battle was evolving, not ending, and they would be part of whatever came next. Because wars don't pause to let exhausted soldiers rest. The relief of Bastogne was complete. The Battle of the Bulge had weeks yet to run. December 27th, 1944, dawn. A combat engineer from the 26th Infantry Division crouches in frozen mud beside the Assenoise corridor, probing the ground ahead with a bayonet, looking for the distinctive resistance that means a mine buried just beneath the surface. German forces had 7 days to prepare defences around Bastogne, and they used that time to mine every approach, every secondary road, every field that American vehicles might cross. His job is to find these mines before American trucks hit them, to clear a path wide enough for two-way traffic, to do all of this while German artillery shells land randomly around him. He's 20 years old, from Nebraska, trained as an engineer but working essentially as a human metal detector. Behind him, traffic is backing up on the single cleared route, trucks loaded with ammunition and wounded waiting for his team to finish. Ahead, perhaps 50 yards away, German infantry hold positions from which they can fire on anyone in the open. The corridor to Bastogne is open, but it's a death trap, and his job is to make it survivable. He finds the mine, marks it with white tape, and moves forward to find the next one. The tactical challenge facing American forces after December 26th was fundamentally different from the relief operation. Breaking through to Bastogne required speed and aggression, concentrate force, and punch through. Widening the corridor required methodical, unglamorous infantry work, clearing German positions house by house, securing flanking terrain, establishing defensive lines that could withstand counterattacks. It was the kind of fighting that consumed time and lives without producing dramatic breakthroughs. The 35th Infantry Division, ordered to attack west of the corridor on December 27th, discovered this immediately. Every village was a fortress. Every tree line concealed German machine guns. Every advance brought artillery fire from German guns positioned on high ground with perfect observation. The division attacked all day and gained 800 yards, roughly half a mile, at a cost of 200 casualties. At that rate, Widening the corridor to a safe 3-mile width would take weeks and cost thousands of men. German forces surrounding Bastogne were adapting their tactics from assault to strangulation. Since they couldn't recapture the town, they would make its relief meaningless by cutting the corridor. Panzer Division, which had been attempting to enter Bastogne from the south, now shifted to attacking the corridor itself. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division probed constantly from the east, looking for weak spots in American lines, and elements of the Führer Grenadier Brigade, an elite formation pulled from Army Group Reserve, moved into positions north of the corridor. These units weren't trying to achieve dramatic breakthroughs. They were grinding away at American positions, forcing the defenders to commit more troops, inflicting steady casualties, making the corridor more expensive to hold than it had been to create. It was attritional warfare, the kind of fighting that favors defenders and exhausts attackers, and it was exactly what American commanders had hoped to avoid. December 28th brought weather that made every tactical problem worse. Heavy fog settled over the Ardennes, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards in most sectors. The fog grounded Allied aircraft, eliminating the air support that had proved so valuable on December 23rd. It also enabled German forces to move in daytime, concentrating for attacks without being spotted by American observation. The result was a series of vicious small unit engagements, Americans and Germans fighting each other at ranges where artillery support was dangerous to both sides. A platoon from the 134th Infantry Regiment, defending a sector east of the corridor, reported German infantry advancing through fog so thick that the defenders couldn't see them until they were 20 yards away. The ensuing firefight was brutal and short, decided by whoever reacted faster. The platoon held, but took 50% casualties doing so. Multiply that engagement by dozens occurring simultaneously along a 10-mile front, and the scale of the grinding battle becomes clear. The villages around Bastogne, places with names Americans struggled to pronounce, became killing grounds that swallowed entire companies. Cibret, 2 miles east of the corridor, changed hands 3 times in 36 hours. Villerue, on the northern approach, was the site of hand-to-hand fighting that left both American and German dead lying in the streets for days before graves registration could reach them. Chinogny became infamous for what happened there on New Year's Day, when soldiers from the 11th Armored Division, having discovered the bodies of murdered American prisoners, killed approximately 60 German POWs in retaliation. The incident was hushed up, buried in after-action reports, not investigated seriously until decades later, but it illustrated the moral erosion that occurred in battles like this, where both sides fought with escalating brutality, where rules and restraints dissolved under the pressure of continuous combat in conditions that tested human endurance past breaking. The artillery duel that developed around Bastogne was the most intense concentration of American and German guns in the entire Ardennes battle. German forces had excellent observation from high ground, could mass fire on the corridor and Bastogne itself, and received adequate ammunition supplies from depots that hadn't been captured or destroyed. American artillery advantages lay in numbers and fire control. More guns, better communications, forward observers who could call in fire missions within minutes. The result was a near-constant exchange of fire, American counter-battery missions trying to silence German guns responding by targeting American firing positions. The noise was incredible, described by soldiers as a continuous thunder that never entirely stopped, day or night. Sleep became impossible except from pure exhaustion. Soldiers learned to distinguish between incoming and outgoing fire by sound alone, the slight difference in pitch that meant safety or danger. And the ground itself was torn apart, fields and forests cratered so thoroughly that the landscape looked lunar. December 29th brought commitment of the 87th Infantry Division to the Bastogne sector, and with it a lesson in how quickly inexperienced troops could be chewed up in this kind of fighting. The 87th was a relatively green division, arrived in Europe only in December, with soldiers who'd never been in combat. They were thrown into an attack north of Bastogne, expected to break through German defensive lines and secure high ground that overlooked the corridor. The attack failed catastrophically. German forces, veterans from the Russian front who'd survived years of combat, waited until American infantry was within 100 yards, then opened fire with machine guns and mortars positioned in mutually supporting positions. The 87th took over 300 casualties on the first day, many of them from a single battalion that walked into a pre-registered kill zone. By New Year's Day, the division had lost over 1,000 men and gained less than a mile of ground. The casualty rate was unsustainable, but the pressure to widen the corridor was unrelenting. The logistical strain of maintaining forces around Bastogne tested Third Army's supply system to its limits. Every division in the sector required daily deliveries of ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies. All of it had to pass through a limited number of routes, many of them under German artillery fire. Supply officers performed miracles of organization, coordinating convoys, scheduling movements to avoid congestion, pre-positioning stocks where they'd be available when needed, but the system operated at maximum capacity with no margin for error. A single bridge destroyed by German artillery could back up traffic for hours. A fuel truck hit by a shell meant units running low on gas. An ammunition shortage in one sector meant artillery couldn't support attacks in progress. The supply officers who kept this functioning received no medals, made no newspaper headlines, but their work was as critical to holding Bastogne as the combat soldiers who did the fighting. January 1st, 1945, brought an unexpected development that temporarily shifted air superiority. Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's last major offensive operation of the war, German fighters and fighter bombers assembled for a surprise attack on Allied airfields, struck at dawn across Belgium, France, and the Netherlands. Over 800 German aircraft participated, the largest German air operation since 1940. Allied airfields were caught by surprise, planes destroyed on the ground, hangars and fuel dumps set ablaze. For a few hours, it seemed the Luftwaffe had achieved a significant victory, but the operation was Pyrrhic at best. The Germans lost approximately 300 aircraft, mostly to anti-aircraft fire, losses they couldn't replace. Experienced pilots who'd survived years of war were killed, attacking targets of limited strategic value, and by afternoon, Allied fighters were operating again, having absorbed the attack and continued missions. For the soldiers around Bastogne, Bodenplatte meant one thing: German air attacks that added to the general misery of ground combat. The psychological toll of this phase of fighting was severe and cumulative. Soldiers who'd survived the initial German breakthrough, the race to Bastogne, the siege, and the relief now faced an indefinite period of attritional combat with no clear endpoint. Battle fatigue, the contemporary term for what would later be called PTSD, became epidemic. Men developed the 1,000-yard stare, eyes that looked through people rather than at them. Others suffered physical symptoms, uncontrollable shaking, inability to eat, insomnia so severe that sleep came only from exhaustion, collapse. Some soldiers broke entirely, refusing to fight, curling into fetal positions in foxholes, requiring evacuation as psychiatric casualties. The Army's medical system was unprepared for the scale of psychiatric casualties, and treatment was often inadequate. A few days rest, perhaps some sedation, then back to the line. The assumption was that most battle fatigue was temporary, treatable with time away from combat. But for many soldiers fighting around Bastogne in late December and early January, the trauma was permanent, wounds that wouldn't manifest for years but were as real as any physical injury. The question commanders asked throughout this period was whether the cost was sustainable. Third Army was losing 10,000 men per week in the Bastogne sector, counting killed, wounded, and non-battle casualties like frostbite and trench foot. Divisions rotated in at full strength and came out combat ineffective within days. The tactical gains were minimal, measured in hundreds of yards, and the strategic objective, eliminating the German salient, seemed no closer despite the casualties. Patton argued for continuing the offensive, insisted that maintaining pressure would eventually crack German defences. Bradley worried that Third Army was being bled white for limited gains. Eisenhower faced the fundamental question of military leadership. When does persistence become futility? The corridor to Bastogne was open and getting wider, but the price of widening it was approaching the price that had been paid to open it initially. And the Battle of the Bulge was entering its third week with no end in sight. December 31st brought a grim milestone. Total American casualties in the Ardennes exceeded 50,000. 19,000 dead, 31,000 wounded. The number would continue rising through January. For the soldiers in frozen foxholes around Bastogne, these statistics were abstractions. What mattered was the man next to you, whether he'd survive the next artillery barrage, whether the supplies would arrive before you ran out of ammunition, whether relief would come before you froze to death. The macro-level battle, strategic considerations about salients and counter-offensives meant nothing compared to the micro-level reality of staying alive through one more day of winter combat. The door to Bastogne was open. Keeping it open was proving as hard as opening it had been, and nobody could say how much longer the grinding would continue before something, either German capability or American will, finally broke. December 26th, 1944, Führer headquarters, somewhere in Germany. Adolf Hitler stares at a map showing the Ardennes front, his hands trembling with what aides attribute to Parkinson's disease, but might equally be rage. The red line marking the German advance has stopped moving west for 2 days. It's been static. Bastogne, that insignificant Belgian town that should have fallen in the first 48 hours, remains in American hands. Worse, the corridor his commanders swore couldn't be opened has been opened. American armor is flowing into the town. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace has stalled 60 miles from its start line and over 100 miles from its objective. Hitler's generals stand in uncomfortable silence, waiting for the explosion they know is coming. When it arrives, it's focused on blame, weak commanders, insufficient effort, betrayal by the officer corps. Nobody mentions that the plan was flawed from conception, that Germany lacked the fuel, manpower, and air power to reach Antwerp, even if everything went perfectly. By January 1st, the Ardennes offensive has definitively failed, but it will take weeks more of fighting before that failure translates into German withdrawal. The high watermark of the German advance came on December 24th, when elements of 2nd Panzer Division reached the village of Selles, just 4 miles from the Meuse River. Reconnaissance elements could see the bridges, the objectives that represented the next phase of Hitler's plan, but they would never reach them. The division was critically low on fuel, scattered across miles of Belgian countryside, vulnerable to counterattack, and completely exposed on its flanks. American forces, recognizing the danger, concentrated against this spearhead. British XXX Corps moved into blocking positions west of the Meuse. 2nd Armoured Division attacked from the north. Fighter bombers, operating in clear weather for the first time in days, savaged German columns that had no air cover. By December 26th, 2nd Panzer Division was destroyed as a fighting formation, its surviving elements retreating east, abandoning vehicles that had run out of fuel. The division that came closest to achieving Hitler's objective was annihilated within sight of it. The strategic arithmetic of the Ardennes offensive revealed why military professionals had considered Hitler's plan impossible from the beginning. German forces committed to the offensive, approximately 250,000 men in 30 divisions, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, 2,000 artillery pieces. Fuel available, roughly 2.5 million gallons, enough for perhaps 100 miles of operations under ideal conditions. Fuel required to reach Antwerp, at least 5 million gallons, assuming no combat losses, no mechanical breakdowns, no detours. The plan assumed capturing American fuel depots intact, but American forces destroyed or evacuated their supplies before German forces could seize them. By December 20th, German panzers were already running out of fuel. By December 25th, entire divisions were immobilized. The offensive failed not because American resistance was unexpectedly strong, though it was, but because the logistical foundation was inadequate from day one. Hitler had gambled that captured supplies would make up the deficit. The gamble failed completely. The casualties Germany suffered in the Ardennes were irreplaceable, and that fact doomed any German hope of prolonging the war significantly. By January 1st, Wehrmacht losses exceeded 100,000 men. 25,000 killed, 40,000 wounded, the rest missing or captured. 800 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. 1,000 aircraft lost, many with their experienced pilots. These weren't losses Germany could absorb. The strategic reserve Hitler had hoarded since Normandy was gone, committed to an offensive that achieved nothing except burning through Germany's last mobile forces. When the Soviet winter offensive began on January 12th, the Eastern Front had no reserves to stop it. German forces that might have slowed the Russian advance were dead or crippled in Belgian forests. The Ardennes offensive didn't just fail militarily. It guaranteed Germany's defeat within 4 months by destroying the forces that might have prolonged resistance. The failure points in Hitler's plan are clear in retrospect, but were evident to professional military officers from the beginning. Streetvith was supposed to fall on December 17th. It held until December 23rd, 6 days that forced German columns onto inadequate secondary roads. Elsenborn Ridge, the northern shoulder of the attack, was supposed to crack under SS assault in the first days. The 99th Infantry Division held it throughout the battle, denying 6th SS Panzer Army access to the main highways north. Bastogne was supposed to be taken by December 18th. It never fell, tying down German forces desperately needed elsewhere. These failures weren't bad luck or insufficient effort. They were the inevitable result of a plan that assumed everything would go perfectly in an environment where nothing ever does. The American forces Hitler expected to collapse instead fought stubbornly, traded space for time, and held key positions long enough for reinforcements to arrive. German tactical proficiency couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. Hitler's reaction to failure was to double down, demand continued offensive operations, and blame everyone except himself. On December 28th, he authorized a secondary offensive in Alsace, Operation Nordwind, designed to draw Allied attention away from the Ardennes. The operation achieved tactical surprise but strategic irrelevance, forcing local American retreats but contributing nothing to the Ardennes situation. On January 3rd, Hitler finally authorized limited withdrawals from the Bastogne sector, but only after German forces there had been bled white in futile attempts to cut the corridor, and he continued insisting, against all evidence, that the Ardennes offensive could be renewed if his commanders showed proper National Socialist spirit. German generals who suggested withdrawal were relieved or threatened with court-martial. The Wehrmacht fought on, not because victory was possible, but because Hitler refused to admit defeat. The human cost of that refusal would be paid by German soldiers dying in futile defensive battles throughout January and February. The Soviet contribution to ending the Battle of the Bulge is often overlooked in Western histories, but it was significant. Stalin, informed of the German offensive by Churchill and Eisenhower, agreed to accelerate the Red Army's winter offensive to relieve pressure on the Western Allies. The Vistula-Oder offensive began on January 12th, earlier than originally planned, with Soviet forces attacking across a 400-mile front from the Baltic to the Carpathians. The offensive achieved staggering success, advancing over 300 miles in 3 weeks, liberating Warsaw and reaching the Oder River by February. Hitler's response was to transfer divisions from the west to shore up the collapsing Eastern Front. By mid-January, German units were being pulled out of the Ardennes and shipped east by rail, weakening the forces fighting American and British counteroffensives. The Battle of the Bulge ended not with a decisive American victory, but with German forces withdrawing to meet the larger threat from the east. The question of whether the Ardennes offensive ever had a chance of success has occupied military historians for decades. The consensus is clear. No realistic possibility existed of reaching Antwerp or achieving Hitler's strategic objectives. But debates continue about whether a more limited success was possible. Could German forces have reached the Meuse if Bastogne had fallen? Probably, but Allied forces would have established defensive positions on the West Bank, and German panzers lacked fuel to continue offensive operations. Could the Wehrmacht have inflicted enough casualties to force the Allies into negotiations? No, because American industrial capacity replaced losses within weeks, while German losses were permanent. Could the offensive have delayed Allied victory by months? Possibly, if it had succeeded in pushing American forces back to defensive positions, but the Soviet advance would have continued regardless. Every counterfactual runs into the same fundamental problem. Germany lacked the resources to achieve anything beyond tactical success, and tactical success without strategic possibility was meaningless. December 30th brought a moment of dark comedy that illustrated the difference between Hitler's perception and battlefield reality. A German propaganda broadcast announced that Bastogne had been captured, the American garrison destroyed, and German panzers were racing toward the Meuse. The broadcast was heard by American soldiers in Bastogne, who responded with laughter and obscenities. German officers who knew better tried to correct the record, but Berlin insisted the propaganda version was true. Hitler, isolated in his headquarters, surrounded by yes-men, afraid to contradict him, believed what he wanted to believe. The gap between his understanding and reality was total. While he planned renewed offensives and issued orders for attacks, his armies were desperately trying to establish defensive positions that might slow American counteroffensives. The disconnect between strategic fantasy and tactical reality guaranteed not just defeat but catastrophic defeat. By January 1st, 1945, the shape of the battle's ending was clear to anyone willing to see it. German forces held a salient 60 miles deep and 40 miles wide at its base, a position that invited encirclement. Allied forces were converging from north and south, First Army attacking from the north, Third Army from the south, both aiming to meet at Houffalize and cut off German forces in the tip of the bulge. German commanders recommended immediate withdrawal to defensive lines along the German border, preserving combat power for the battles to come. Hitler refused, insisting that every yard of gained ground be held. The result was predictable. Continued casualties for both sides, ultimate German withdrawal under pressure, and loss of forces that might have been saved by earlier retreat. The Battle of the Bulge would continue through January, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. Hitler's last gamble had failed. Germany's defeat was now a matter of time, measured in weeks rather than months, and the soldiers fighting in frozen Belgian forests would continue dying for objectives that no longer mattered strategically, because wars don't end cleanly, and failed offensives require weeks of additional combat to resolve their consequences. January 9th, 1945, General George Patton stands over a map table at his headquarters in Luxembourg, pointing at the Belgian town of Houffalize with his riding crop. "That's where we link up with First Army," he tells his staff, 25 miles north of Bastogne. "Cut the bulge in half, trap whatever German forces haven't withdrawn, end this thing." His operations officer, studying the map, notes that those 25 miles are defended by German forces that have spent 2 weeks preparing positions, that the terrain favours defence, that winter weather will prevent adequate air support, and that Third Army divisions are already exhausted from 3 weeks of continuous combat. Patton's response is characteristic. "I don't care what's between us and Houffalize. We attack tomorrow, we attack continuously, and we don't stop until we're there, or the Germans quit. Probably be there in 3 days." His staff exchanges glances. They've heard Patton's optimistic timelines before. They know the reality will be harder than he's predicting. But they also know that Third Army will attack as ordered, because that's what Third Army does. The relief of Bastogne is complete, the elimination of the bulge is beginning, and it will prove far more costly than the relief operation. The tactical situation on January 9th revealed everything that made attacking in winter conditions difficult. German forces, recognizing that the Ardennes offensive had failed, had transitioned from attack to defense, establishing positions that maximized terrain advantages. Villages became fortresses, forests provided concealment, and high ground gave observation over American approaches. The weather remained miserable, temperatures below zero, snow and ice covering everything, overcast conditions that grounded aircraft more often than not. And the German soldiers, though demoralized by their offensive's failure, were experienced troops who knew how to fight defensive battles. They couldn't prevent American advance, but they could slow it, make every mile cost casualties, buy time for their comrades to withdraw from the bulge before encirclement became complete. For Third Army soldiers, attacking north from Bastogne toward Houffalize meant entering a killing ground where German advantages in terrain and defensive preparation offset American advantages in numbers and firepower. The 6th Armoured Division jumped off on January 10th, leading Third Army's attack, and immediately discovered that this would be nothing like the relief operation. The relief had been a race against time with a clear objective: reach Bastogne. The push to Houffalize was an advance into prepared defences with no dramatic rescue mission to motivate soldiers. The enemy wasn't a besieged garrison that needed saving, but empty Belgian countryside that had to be cleared yard by yard. German resistance was fanatical in some sectors, perfunctory in others, making it impossible to predict where the next fight would develop. The division's after-action report recorded advances measured in hundreds of yards per day, not miles. Casualties were heavy, 50 to 100 men per day, day after day, grinding down combat strength without visible progress. Tank losses mounted from mines, anti-tank guns, and simple mechanical breakdown in conditions that stressed equipment beyond design limits. Patton's diary entries during this period reveal his growing frustration with the pace of operations. "We can still lose this war," he wrote on January 13th, an extraordinary admission from a general known for confidence. He understood that Third Army was exhausted, that divisions needed rest and refitting, that continuing offensive operations in these conditions was grinding down combat effectiveness. But he also understood, or believed he understood, that maintaining offensive pressure was the only way to end the battle. Allowing German forces to withdraw unmolested meant they'd establish new defensive lines closer to Germany, prolonging the war. So Third Army attacked day after day, despite casualties, despite weather, despite diminishing returns. The strategy was attritional, trading American lives for German withdrawals, betting that American industrial capacity could replace losses faster than German capacity could. The bet was probably correct strategically. For the soldiers doing the dying, strategic correctness was cold comfort. January 13th brought some of the worst winter weather of the entire battle. Temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit in some sectors. Soldiers suffered frostbite just from being outside, let alone fighting. Vehicles wouldn't start without hours of engine preheating. Artillery pieces had reduced range because propellants didn't burn efficiently at such low temperatures. Infantry attacks became exercises in endurance rather than tactics. Get men to the objective before they froze. Worry about fighting the enemy after everyone arrived. Medical personnel treated more cold weather casualties than combat wounds. Trench foot, caused by feet staying wet in cold conditions for days, led to thousands of evacuations. Soldiers whose boots got wet faced a choice: keep fighting and risk permanent injury, or seek medical treatment and be branded a malingerer. The Army's official policy was that adequate foot hygiene prevented trench foot, placing responsibility on individual soldiers. The reality was that combat conditions made proper foot care impossible, and soldiers were being invalided out of the Army for conditions their commanders should have prevented. The junction at Houffalize, when it finally occurred on January 16th, was anticlimactic in the extreme. Patrols from 3rd Army's 11th Armoured Division met patrols from 1st Army's 2nd Armoured Division in the rubble of the town, shook hands for photographers, and filed reports confirming the link-up. But there was no trapped German army, no mass surrender, no dramatic end to the battle. German forces had withdrawn methodically over the previous week, saving most of their combat power, establishing new defensive lines east of Houffalize. The Bulge was eliminated as a geographic feature, but the Battle of the Bulge continued as a military operation. American forces now had to attack those new German lines, pushing toward the original front lines of mid-December, fighting for ground that had been held without contest 6 weeks earlier. The irony was bitter: thousands of casualties to recapture terrain that had been given up without a fight. The strategic debate between Patton and Eisenhower during this period revealed fundamental disagreement about how to conclude the battle. Patton wanted to let German forces remain in the Bulge, then cut them off at the base of the salient, trapping entire divisions that could be destroyed or forced to surrender. His model was the Falaise pocket in France, where aggressive Allied attacks had trapped and destroyed German 7th Army. Eisenhower rejected the proposal, ordering instead that the Bulge be eliminated through systematic pressure from north and south, pushing German forces back to their start lines. The cautious approach meant fewer risks of American forces being counterattacked on exposed flanks. It also meant allowing German forces to escape encirclement, saving combat power that would fight again in the Rhineland battles. Patton argued bitterly that caution was costing American lives by prolonging the war. Eisenhower replied that recklessness would cost more lives through tactical defeats. The argument was never fully resolved, but Eisenhower's authority was supreme. The Bulge was eliminated his way, methodically and safely, at a cost Patton considered unnecessary. January 20th brought unofficial acknowledgement that the Battle of the Bulge was over. American forces had pushed German troops back to the start lines of December 16th. The salient was eliminated. The crisis had passed, but official declarations of victory were avoided, partly because fighting continued, partly because the cost made celebration seem inappropriate. Third Army alone had suffered 26,000 casualties in operations around Bastogne between December 22nd and January 20th. First Army casualties in the northern part of the Bulge exceeded Third Army's. British forces that held blocking positions took their own losses, and the 101st Airborne Division, the garrison that held Bastogne, required months to recover from the siege and subsequent fighting. Total American casualties for the entire Battle of the Bulge would eventually exceed 89,000. German casualties were at least as bad, possibly worse. Records were incomplete. Belgian civilian casualties numbered in the thousands. The battle was over, but its effects would persist for the rest of the war and beyond. The transition from offensive back to defensive operations in late January was psychologically difficult for soldiers who'd spent weeks attacking. Defense meant holding positions, enduring shelling, waiting for something to happen. After the intensity of continuous combat, defensive routine felt simultaneously boring and terrifying. hours of nothing punctuated by moments of extreme danger. Soldiers who'd survived the bulge developed superstitions, rituals they believed had kept them alive. Some refused to shave, others carried specific items as talismans. A few assigned mystical significance to random events, convinced that fate had marked them for survival or death. Battalion chaplains noted increased attendance at religious services, men looking for meaning in experiences that seemed meaningless. Psychological counseling didn't exist in any systematic form. Soldiers dealt with trauma through dark humor, drinking when alcohol was available, and bonds with the men who'd experienced the same horrors. It wasn't healthy, but it was functional, enough to keep divisions combat effective until the war ended. Patton's assessment of his own performance in the Battle of the Bulge was characteristically confident. He'd promised to attack in 3 days and delivered. He'd broken through to Bastogne despite German resistance. He'd eliminated his portion of the Bulge on schedule. The newspapers called him a hero, the general who saved Bastogne, the embodiment of American fighting spirit. Patton believed his own press, but the reality was more complex. The relief of Bastogne succeeded because of careful staff planning before the battle, not improvisation during it. The casualties Third Army suffered, over 40,000 in the Bastogne operations, raised questions about whether more careful tactics might have achieved the same results at lower cost. And Patton's inability to trap German forces, despite his promises of encirclement and destruction, suggested limits to aggressive tactics in winter conditions against skilled defenders. He was a great general, perhaps the best American combat commander of the war, but he wasn't infallible, and the Bulge revealed both his strengths and his limitations. The lasting impact of the Battle of the Bulge on the German war effort was total and irreversible. The offensive consumed Germany's last reserves, the forces that might have delayed Soviet advances in the east or American advances in the west. The Luftwaffe lost 1,000 aircraft it couldn't replace, ending any pretense of German air power. Fuel supplies were exhausted, leaving German armies immobilized. Most critically, the Wehrmacht's aura of tactical superiority was destroyed. German forces had achieved surprise, had broken through American lines, had advanced 60 miles, and they'd still lost, their offensive collapsing from logistical failure and stubborn American resistance. After the Bulge, German soldiers knew the war was lost. They fought on from discipline, fear of Soviet retribution, or ideological fanaticism, but not from belief in victory. The offensive was Germany's last throw of the dice. It came up snake eyes. Everything that followed was aftermath, the slow collapse of a military machine that had exhausted itself in Belgian forests. January 20th, 1945. A captain in the Graves Registration Service walks through a snow-covered field near Bastogne, cataloguing bodies that have lain here since December. The snow kept them preserved, frozen in the positions they died in, but now the snow is melting and the bodies need to be recovered before decomposition makes identification impossible. He's 24 years old, a college student before the war, trained in nothing that prepared him for this work. Each body requires documentation. Dog tags collected, personal effects inventoried, location recorded, cause of death estimated when possible. Some bodies are intact, others were torn apart by artillery. Some died from wounds, others froze to death. The captain writes in his logbook, with hands that shake from cold and something deeper than cold. When historians write about the Battle of the Bulge, they'll speak of strategic objectives and operational maneuvers. They probably won't mention that 19,000 American bodies were scattered across 100 square miles of Belgian countryside, each one representing a person who had a name, a family, a future that ended in frozen mud. The butcher's bill for the Ardennes is coming due. Payment is made in corpses. The final casualty figures for the Battle of the Bulge make it the bloodiest battle American forces fought in Europe. Total American casualties, 89,500, 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, 23,000 missing or captured, most of whom eventually returned from POW camps, but some of whom were never accounted for. Third Army casualties in operations around Bastogne, 26,000. First Army casualties in the northern sectors, approximately 35,000. The 101st Airborne Division, defenders of Bastogne, over 2,000 casualties out of 18,000 engaged. 4th Armoured Division, the Relief Force, over 1,000 casualties in 4 days of fighting. These numbers exceed American casualties at Normandy on D-Day. They exceed losses in Operation Market Garden. The Bulge was America's costliest battle, and most Americans today don't know it happened. German casualties were proportionally higher, but less precisely documented. Wehrmacht records were incomplete, destroyed, or never properly maintained in the chaos of the battle. Estimates range from 80,000 to 120,000 total German casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. At least 25,000 killed, somewhere around 40,000 wounded who reached medical facilities, and the rest missing, a category that included men captured, men who died of wounds before receiving treatment, men who froze to death in forests and weren't found for months, and men who simply deserted when the offensive collapsed. Equipment losses were staggering. 800 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned, over 1,000 aircraft lost, 592 artillery pieces captured or destroyed. For Germany, fighting a two-front war with exhausted industry, these losses were irreplaceable. The Wehrmacht that emerged from the Bulge was a broken force, capable of defensive fighting but never again of major offensive operations. Belgian civilian casualties are the forgotten tragedy of the battle, documented incompletely and mourned insufficiently. Approximately 3,000 Belgian civilians died during the Ardennes fighting. Some were killed by German artillery falling on their towns. Others died from American artillery and airstrikes hitting villages held by Germans. Some were murdered deliberately by retreating SS troops who saw Belgian civilians as partisan sympathizers. Families died in cellars when buildings collapsed from shelling. Children starved when food supplies were cut off. Elderly froze to death when homes were destroyed and no shelter remained. The Belgian government after the war compiled lists of civilian dead, but the lists were incomplete because entire families died with no one surviving to report them. For Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge was the final trauma of a war that had brought 4.5 years of occupation, deportation, and suffering. Liberation turned into a new battlefield, and civilians paid the price. The cold weather casualties, those not caused by enemy action, equaled combat casualties in some units and exceeded them in others. Frostbite cases numbered over 15,000 in American forces alone. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and damp, accounted for another several thousand evacuations. Both conditions caused permanent damage if not treated quickly, and field treatment was often inadequate. Soldiers with severe frostbite lost toes, feet, sometimes entire lower legs to amputation. Trench foot survivors faced lifetime disabilities, nerve damage that caused chronic pain, circulatory problems that made them vulnerable to cold for the rest of their lives. These men were casualties as real as those shot by German bullets, but they received less recognition because their injuries seemed preventable. The army blamed soldiers for inadequate foot hygiene. Soldiers blamed the army for inadequate equipment and impossible conditions. Both were right. The cold weather casualties were the price of winter warfare with an army that hadn't adequately prepared for it. Psychological casualties, what the army called battle fatigue or combat exhaustion, ran at approximately 10% of total casualties. 9,000 men were evacuated from the Bulge for psychiatric reasons. They exhibited symptoms including uncontrollable shaking, inability to respond to orders, hysterical crying, catatonic withdrawal, and violent outbursts. Medical treatment was primitive by modern standards. Rest, sedation, sometimes verbal reassurance that they weren't cowards. Many returned to duty within days or weeks. Others were evacuated to rear area hospitals. A few were discharged from service. The Army's understanding of combat stress was limited. The prevailing theory was that psychological casualties resulted from insufficient willpower or moral weakness, with proper motivation and discipline preventing most cases. Modern psychiatry recognizes these men suffered from what's now called PTSD, a normal psychological response to abnormal stress. But in 1945, they were often viewed as failures, men who broke under pressure that others withstood. Many carried shame about their breakdown for the rest of their lives. Letters arriving in American homes between January and March 1945 brought the personal dimension of the casualty statistics. Western Union telegrams with their distinctive yellow envelopes became symbols of dread. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son. The messages were formulaic, identical except for names and unit information. The grief they caused was unique to each family. A mother in Nebraska learning her only son died in Belgium. A wife in Texas told her husband was missing in action. Parents in Michigan informed their son was wounded, severity unknown. Each telegram represented a family's world destroyed, a future erased, pain that would never entirely heal. The Battle of the Bulge created approximately 14,000 American widows and orphaned roughly 25,000 children. These numbers don't appear in operational histories, but they're as much a part of the battle's cost as casualty statistics. The physical destruction in the Ardennes region took years to repair and in some cases was never fully remedied. Villages were rubble, roads were cratered from shelling, forests were stripped of trees, turned into moonscapes by artillery, unexploded ordnance littered the countryside, shells and mines that would kill Belgian farmers for decades after the war. The town of Bastogne itself was severely damaged, approximately 40% of buildings destroyed or heavily damaged. The cost of physical reconstruction ran into hundreds of millions of dollars in contemporary terms. But the psychological damage to the region was incalculable. The Ardennes had been invaded twice in 25 years, in World War I and again in World War II. The Battle of the Bulge was the third time in a generation that Belgian civilians had experienced total war in their villages. The trauma shaped regional identity for generations. Equipment losses for American forces were substantial and revealed both the resilience and limitations of the U.S. logistics system. 733 tanks and tank destroyers destroyed, 592 artillery pieces lost. Thousands of trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks destroyed or damaged. Huge quantities of ammunition expended, over 70 million rounds of small arms ammunition, millions of artillery shells, hundreds of thousands of mortar rounds. The impressive fact is not the losses, but how quickly they were replaced. American industry in 1945 was producing tanks faster than German forces could destroy them, artillery at rates that made losses irrelevant, ammunition in quantities that seemed limitless. By mid-February, divisions that fought in the Bulge were back at full equipment strength. Germany couldn't match this. Every tank lost was irreplaceable. Every artillery piece destroyed created a gap in defensive fires. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated not just American battlefield performance, but American industrial capacity, the ability to take terrible losses and immediately replace them. The medical system's handling of wounded from the Bulge stressed field hospitals beyond design capacity but never completely broke down. Evacuation from front lines to battalion aid stations to field hospitals to general hospitals to transport back to England or the United States functioned despite weather, enemy fire, and overwhelming casualty loads. Doctors performed surgery in field tents, often by flashlight when generators failed, amputating damaged limbs to save lives, treating sucking chest wounds with techniques improvised on the spot, operating continuously for days during the heaviest fighting. Survival rates for wounded soldiers who reached medical care were remarkably high. Approximately 95% of those treated survived. Penicillin, available in large quantities by 1944, prevented infections that would have killed thousands in previous wars. Plasma and whole blood transfusions saved men who would have died from blood loss. The medics, doctors, and nurses who treated Bulge casualties received little recognition in popular histories, but they saved as many American lives as any combat unit. The lasting question about the Battle of the Bulge's human cost is whether it was necessary. Could Bastogne have been relieved at lower cost? Probably, if Third Army had attacked more methodically, accepting slower progress for fewer casualties. Could the Bulge have been eliminated with fewer losses? Possibly, if Eisenhower had allowed Patton to attempt encirclement, though that strategy carried its own risks. Could American forces have avoided the initial surprise? Almost certainly, if intelligence warnings had been properly evaluated and acted upon. But military history doesn't offer do-overs. Soldiers fought and died in the circumstances they faced, not ideal circumstances that might have been engineered with perfect foresight. The butcher's bill was paid in full. 89,000 American casualties bought elimination of Germany's last offensive capability and shortened the war by months. Whether that exchange was worth the cost is a question without an objective answer. For the soldiers who survived, it was a high price paid for necessary victory. For the families of those who died, no victory could justify the loss. May 8th, 1945, VE Day. Staff officers at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force compile final reports on the war in Europe, documenting campaigns, casualties, lessons learned. One report analyses the Battle of the Bulge with the cold clarity that only hindsight provides. Hitler's offensive delayed the Allied advance to the Rhine by approximately 6 weeks. It cost Germany its last strategic reserves, over 100,000 casualties, and any remaining capability for offensive operations. It achieved none of its objectives, didn't split the Allied armies, didn't capture Antwerp, didn't force negotiated peace. The report's conclusion is clinical. The Ardennes offensive was Germany's last major military effort in the West. Its failure made Allied victory inevitable and shortened the war by eliminating German forces that might have prolonged resistance. What the report doesn't capture, can't capture in bureaucratic language, is what those 6 weeks meant to the soldiers who fought them, to the families who lost sons and husbands, to the Belgian civilians who endured another German invasion. Statistics and strategic analysis don't convey the cold, the fear, the death, but they're what history preserves. The strategic assessment of Hitler's plan, conducted by Allied intelligence after the war and by German commanders during interrogation, revealed a fundamental disconnect between political will and military possibility. Hitler wanted to repeat 1940 to achieve through surprise and audacity what Germany no longer possessed the resources to accomplish. His generals told him the plan was impossible, that fuel supplies were inadequate, that Allied air superiority would destroy German columns once weather cleared, that even if the offensive reached the Meuse, it couldn't cross against prepared defences. Hitler overruled all objections, insisted that willpower could overcome material limitations, and threatened anyone who expressed defeatism with execution. The result was predictable. Tactical successes in the opening days, operational failure within a week, strategic catastrophe within a month. German officers who survived told interrogators that they'd known from the beginning the offensive would fail. They attacked anyway because Hitler's Germany didn't tolerate dissent. The Bulge demonstrated that authoritarian command systems fail when reality contradicts ideology. The fuel mathematics that doomed the German offensive are stark and incontrovertible. German forces needed approximately 5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. They started the offensive with 2.5 million gallons in supply dumps and tanker trucks. The plan explicitly assumed capturing American fuel depots would provide the remaining 2.5 million gallons. But American forces destroyed or evacuated their fuel supplies before German forces could seize them. The largest captured fuel dump, near Stavelot, contained over 2.5 million gallons, exactly what German planners needed. American engineers destroyed it just hours before Piper's Kampfgruppe arrived. Without captured fuel, German panzers ran dry within days. Entire divisions were immobilized, tanks were abandoned with their guns still loaded, simply out of gas. The offensive became a foot slog, infantry advancing while their armour support sat useless on roadsides. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome empty fuel tanks. Hitler's plan required a miracle that never occurred. The impact of the Ardennes offensive on the Eastern Front was Germany's real strategic disaster. Hitler committed his last reserves to an offensive in the West, while the Soviet Union prepared a massive winter offensive in the East. The Vistula-Oder offensive, launched on January 12th, advanced over 300 miles in 3 weeks, reached the Oder River by early February, and placed Soviet forces within 50 miles of Berlin. German forces defending against this onslaught lacked reserves, because those reserves were dead or captured in Belgium. Hitler had gambled that success in the West would free forces to defend the East. The gamble's failure meant catastrophic defeats on both fronts. The Wehrmacht was crushed between Soviet advances from the East and Allied advances from the West, unable to adequately defend either front. Germany could have lost the war without the Ardennes offensive. The offensive guaranteed that defeat would come quickly and completely. Patton's contribution to defeating the Ardennes offensive is substantial but has been mythologized beyond recognition. He did turn Third Army 90 degrees in 72 hours, an impressive logistical achievement. He did relieve Bastogne within his promised timeline. His aggressive leadership prevented German forces from cutting the corridor after it opened. But he didn't single-handedly win the Battle of the Bulge, as some hagiographic accounts suggest. The 101st Airborne defended Bastogne for a week before Patton arrived. First Army stabilised the northern shoulder and contained the main German thrust. British XXX Corps blocked German access to the Meuse crossings. The Battle of the Bulge was won by Allied combined arms cooperation, not by one general's brilliance. Patton's real achievement was demonstrating that American forces could execute complex operations under crisis conditions, that flexibility and aggressive action could compensate for initial surprise. That's significant. It's not legendary. The question of whether Hitler's plan ever had a realistic chance of success has been answered definitively by post-war analysis. No. Even if everything had gone perfectly for Germany, if Street, Vith and Bastogne had fallen on schedule, If fuel had been captured, if weather had remained overcast, the offensive still would have failed. Allied material superiority was too great. American reinforcements arrived faster than German commanders anticipated. The logistics of modern mobile warfare required resources Germany didn't possess. At best, a completely successful Ardennes offensive might have delayed Allied victory by 2 or 3 months. It couldn't have forced negotiated peace, couldn't have split the Allied coalition, couldn't have changed the war's outcome. Hitler's desperation produced a plan that risked Germany's last resources for minimal potential gain. Professional military officers recognized this. Hitler didn't care. The Bulge was a political offensive designed to demonstrate German fighting spirit and provide hope to a demoralized population. It failed militarily and psychologically, convincing even true believers that Germany couldn't win. The Allied response to the German offensive, evaluated critically, shows both excellence and failures. The excellence: rapid commitment of reserves, flexible command relationships, ability to shift forces between armies without bureaucratic delays. Eisenhower's decision to release the airborne divisions immediately was correct. His willingness to give Montgomery temporary command of northern forces, though politically controversial, was militarily sound. The logistical system that supplied forces throughout the battle never broke down despite enormous strain. The failures: intelligence missed clear indicators of the offensive. Forward units were positioned too thinly and with inadequate reserves. Initial responses were confused and uncoordinated. Some units fought magnificently while others collapsed. The Battle of the Bulge revealed that Allied forces could absorb surprise attacks and recover quickly, but it also showed persistent weaknesses in intelligence evaluation and defensive preparation. The victory was real. It wasn't flawless. The debate about whether more aggressive tactics could have trapped German forces continues among military historians. Patton argued for cutting the base of the Bulge, encircling German divisions in the salient's tip, achieving a Falaise-style destruction. Eisenhower chose methodical pressure from north and south, accepting that German forces would escape but minimizing risk. Who was right? Both strategies had merit. Patton's approach offered potential for decisive victory but risked American forces being caught on exposed flanks if German commanders reacted quickly. Eisenhower's approach was safer but allowed German forces to withdraw in relatively good order, saving combat power that fought again in the Rhineland. Modern analysis suggests Eisenhower's caution was probably correct. German forces in late December 1944, though beaten, weren't broken. They retained defensive capability and could have inflicted serious casualties on American forces attempting deep envelopment. The methodical approach cost time but saved lives. That was Eisenhower's consistent priority throughout the war. The lasting military lessons from the Battle of the Bulge shaped American doctrine for decades. The importance of strategic reserves, maintaining uncommitted forces that could respond to unexpected developments. The value of combined arms warfare: infantry, armor, artillery, and air power working together rather than separately. The necessity of flexible command structures, ability to shift units between commands without bureaucratic friction, the criticality of logistics. Even tactical victories fail without adequate supply lines. And perhaps most importantly, the resilience of American soldiers. They could be surprised, could lose initial engagements, but would fight back aggressively and ultimately prevail. These lessons influenced American military thinking through the Cold War and beyond. The Bulge became a case study in how to absorb an enemy offensive and convert it into victory through superior resources and adaptability. The historical memory of the Battle of the Bulge evolved significantly over the 75 years since it was fought. Immediately after the war, it was celebrated as an American triumph, proof of Allied superiority over German forces. During the Cold War, it became a founding myth of American military excellence, a story of citizen soldiers defeating professional Wehrmacht troops. In recent decades, historians have adopted more nuanced views, recognizing both American successes and failures, acknowledging that victory was costly and not inevitable. Popular culture focuses on Bastogne and Patton's relief, creating the impression that the entire battle was about one town and one general. The reality was far more complex. Multiple battles across a 100-mile front, involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers, decided by factors ranging from weather to logistics to individual courage. The simplified version makes better movies. The complex reality is what actually happened. The question of whether the Battle of the Bulge was worth its cost depends on perspective. Strategically, yes. The battle destroyed Germany's last offensive capability and shortened the war. For soldiers who survived, maybe. They endured hell, but lived to see victory. For families of those who died, almost certainly no. No strategic objective justifies losing a son or husband. For Belgian civilians, definitely no. Liberation turned into another battlefield, causing suffering that served no Belgian interest. For historians, it's a case study, examination of how modern industrial warfare functions under crisis conditions. The Battle of the Bulge meant different things to different people. What it definitively proved was that wars are won by logistics, industrial capacity, and the ability to absorb tactical defeats while maintaining strategic coherence. Germany could win battles, America could win wars. That was the fundamental imbalance the Ardennes offensive couldn't overcome. December 19th, 1944, Verdun. George Patton makes a promise that will define his historical legacy. Attack in 3 days with 3 divisions. Every general in the room, except Patton, thinks it's impossible. What they don't know is that Patton has been planning for exactly this scenario since early December, that his staff has wargamed a German breakthrough and developed contingency plans, that the improvised response is actually careful preparation meeting opportunity. This is the Patton paradox. Was he a military genius who anticipated events others missed, or a showman who claimed credit for staff work and got lucky? 75 years after Bastogne, historians still argue the truth is probably both. Patton was genuinely brilliant at operational warfare, understanding how to move large formations quickly and aggressively. He was also genuinely self-aggrandizing, exaggerating his role and minimizing others' contributions. The relief of Bastogne was simultaneously his finest achievement and evidence that his legend exceeds his reality. Separating the man from the myth requires acknowledging both. The pre-planning that made Third Army's pivot possible was the work of multiple officers, not Patton alone. Colonel Oskar Koch, the intelligence officer, identified the German threat and warned commanders repeatedly. Colonel Halley Maddox, the operations officer, developed the contingency plans that became operational orders. Staff officers throughout Third Army headquarters worked out logistics, routes, communications, everything needed for rapid redeployment. When Patton promised to attack in 3 days, he was promising to execute plans that already existed. His contribution was recognizing the threat's seriousness, authorizing staff to develop responses, and having the confidence to promise execution when others doubted. That's leadership, and it's valuable, but it's not the lone genius narrative that popular accounts promote. Patton succeeded because he built an excellent staff and trusted them to do their jobs. That's less dramatic than the cowboy general myth, but more accurate. The 72-hour timeline, examined critically, was more aspiration than achievement. Patton promised to attack on December 22nd with 3 divisions. What actually happened was that advanced elements of 3 divisions attacked on December 22nd, but the full combat power of those divisions wasn't available for another 24 to 48 hours. Units arrived piecemeal, attacked as they closed on objectives, rather than waiting for complete assembly. This was aggressive and probably correct tactically, but it meant early attacks went in under strength, taking higher casualties than fully coordinated assaults might have suffered. The promise of 3 days was kept on a technicality. Full operational capability took longer. Does this diminish Patton's achievement? Not really. He moved 250,000 men 90 degrees in winter and attacked faster than anyone thought possible. But it does suggest that Patton's promises should be understood as motivational tools rather than precise predictions. The operational style Patton employed during the relief, relentless attack regardless of casualties, was effective but costly. 4th Armoured Division lost over 1,000 men in 4 days, reaching Bastogne. Other divisions took proportional casualties. Patton's philosophy was that aggressive action minimized casualties by ending battles quickly. That hesitation gave enemies time to establish better defenses and ultimately cost more lives. This philosophy is debatable. Aggressive attacks certainly ended the siege of Bastogne faster than methodical approaches would have, but they also produced high casualty rates that made divisions combat ineffective within days. Third Army's casualty rates throughout the war were consistently higher than other American armies in Europe. Was this the inevitable cost of aggressive operations, or evidence that Patton accepted casualties others would have considered excessive? Military historians debate this question without reaching consensus. What's clear is that Patton's methods achieve results, but at human costs that raise ethical questions about command responsibility. Patton's relationship with his subordinate commanders during the Bastogne operation revealed both his strengths and weaknesses as a leader. He inspired loyalty through personal bravery, visiting frontline units under fire, sharing soldiers' dangers. He demanded excellence and held commanders accountable for failures. But he also bullied, threatened relief for officers who didn't meet his standards, and created a climate where admitting problems was tantamount to confessing weakness. Hugh Gaffey, commanding 4th Armoured Division, was subjected to Patton's rage when the relief took longer than expected. Gaffey's division was fighting against determined resistance, taking heavy casualties, doing everything possible to reach Bastogne. Patton's response was to threaten his job. This kind of leadership motivates through fear as much as inspiration. It works up to a point, but it also creates environments where subordinates hide problems rather than reporting them honestly. Patton got results. The costs included relationships and mental health of officers who served under him. The comparison between Patton's performance and other commanders during the Bulge provides useful context. Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st Army on the Northern Shoulder, stabilized a collapsing front and contained the main German thrust. He receives far less recognition than Patton despite achieving more strategically important results. Montgomery, given temporary command of American forces in the north, organized defensive positions and coordinated counterattacks that prevented German breakthrough to the Meuse. He was correct in his assessments and effective in his actions, though he's often vilified in American accounts for political reasons. Bradley, Patton's superior, managed multiple armies simultaneously while dealing with political complications from command arrangements. All of these generals contributed to defeating the Ardennes offensive. Patton's contribution was significant but not unique. The focus on Patton in popular histories says more about American preferences for aggressive, colourful personalities than about actual military effectiveness. The question of whether another commander could have achieved what Patton did is ultimately unanswerable but worth considering. Would 3rd Army have relieved Bastogne under different leadership? Almost certainly yes, because the staff work and unit quality were excellent regardless of who commanded. Would it have happened in 3 days? Possibly not, because Patton's aggressive style pushed subordinates harder than cautious commanders might have. Would casualties have been different? Probably lower, with more cautious tactics, possibly higher if more time allowed German forces to strengthen defences. The counterfactual exercises are speculative, but they suggest that Patton was neither irreplaceable nor purely beneficial. He was a highly effective combat commander whose methods produced results at costs that remain controversial. Military effectiveness and ethical command responsibility don't always align. Patton embodied that tension. Patton's own assessment of his Bastogne performance, recorded in his diary and letters, reveals surprising self-awareness mixed with typical ego. He recognized that the relief succeeded partly through luck, that weather clearing on December 23rd provided crucial air support, that German forces could have cut the corridor if they'd reacted faster. He acknowledged that 4th Armoured Division's breakthrough was a near-run thing, that Abrams' attack on December 26th might easily have failed, but he also credited his own leadership as decisive, believed his aggressive style made the difference between success and failure, and viewed the operation as vindicating his entire military philosophy. The combination of realistic tactical assessment and unrealistic strategic self-evaluation is very Patton. He could analyze battles objectively while simultaneously believing his personal greatness was essential to victory. The cognitive dissonance didn't bother him. It bothers historians trying to evaluate his legacy. The lasting influence of Patton's Bastogne operation on American military culture is immense and not entirely healthy. The operation became proof that aggressive leadership overcomes material obstacles, that willpower and audacity trump careful planning, that American fighting spirit defeats any enemy. These lessons influenced American military thinking for decades, sometimes positively, often problematically. Vietnam saw American commanders applying Patton-style aggression to guerrilla warfare situations where it was counterproductive. Iraq and Afghanistan featured attempts to use decisive operations to solve political problems. The cult of Patton, the general who achieved impossible things through sheer determination, provided justification for operations that careful analysis would have questioned. Patton's real legacy shouldn't be that boldness always succeeds, but that operational flexibility and willing subordinates can achieve remarkable things under crisis conditions. That's a more subtle lesson. It's also more useful. The final assessment of Patton's Bastogne performance must acknowledge both achievement and mythology. He did turn Third Army 90 degrees in 72 hours. He did relieve Bastogne on an aggressive timeline. His leadership inspired soldiers to accomplish difficult missions under terrible conditions. These are genuine accomplishments, worthy of recognition. But he didn't do it alone. The 101st Airborne held Bastogne before he arrived. His staff planned the operation. His subordinate commanders executed the attacks. The legend of Patton the Saviour simplifies a complex operation involving tens of thousands of soldiers into one man's story. That's how military mythology works, reducing complexity to narrative simplicity. But history requires more precision. Patton was an excellent commander who achieved real success at real cost. He was neither the war-winning genius hagiographers claim, nor the reckless glory-seeker critics suggest. He was a talented, flawed, effective general who happened to be in the right place at the right moment to do what he did best, attack. That should be enough for his historical reputation. Apparently it isn't. The mythology continues. 1994, 50 years after the battle. An elderly man sits in his living room in Kansas, speaking to an oral historian about experiences he's never fully described, not even to his wife of 48 years. He was 20 in December 1944, a private in the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, defending Bastogne's perimeter. The cold is what I remember most, he says, voice still strong, despite age. Not the Germans, not the shelling, though God knows there was enough of both. The cold, your feet hurt constantly, your hands stopped working right, you couldn't think clearly. We'd huddled together in foxholes for warmth, 3 or 4 guys pressed against each other, and you could still feel the cold seeping into your bones. He pauses, staring at something the interviewer can't see. 50 years distant. I killed a German on Christmas Eve. He was maybe 10 feet away, came right at our position. I shot him and he fell, and I could see his face, and he looked surprised, like he couldn't believe what happened. He was probably 19, 20 years old, just a kid, like me. I still see his face sometimes. This is what the Battle of the Bulge meant to the men who fought it. Not strategy and operations, but cold and fear, and the faces of men they killed. Creighton Abrams, interviewed in the 1970s before his death, reflected on the relief of Bastogne with surprising ambivalence. By then he was a 4-star general, had commanded American forces in Vietnam, was one of the Army's most respected officers. But when asked about Bastogne, his response wasn't triumphal. We lost a lot of good men getting there. Every mile cost us. I ordered attacks I knew would produce casualties, because we didn't have time for careful tactics. Those decisions were correct, given the mission. But I've thought about them for 30 years, wondered if different choices might have saved lives. You can't command in combat without accepting that you'll order men to their deaths. That's the burden. You learn to carry it. It never gets lighter. Abrams understood better than most that victory's costs aren't just statistics. They're faces, names, men who trusted your judgment and died because of your orders. The relief of Bastogne was his finest military achievement. It was also a source of lifelong guilt about casualties that might have been prevented. A tanker from 4th Armoured Division, recorded in a Veterans History Project interview 2008, described the reality of armoured warfare in winter with brutal clarity. A Sherman tank is a death trap, 30 tons of steel that attracts every German gun. The armour doesn't stop 88s. If you're hit, the tank brews up, catches fire from fuel and ammunition. The crew has maybe 10 seconds to get out before it's an oven. I was the driver, sitting in the front hull with the assistant driver. If we took a hit in front, we were dead. Nothing you could do. Just wait and hope the round hits somewhere else or bounces off. We lost 3 tanks in my platoon getting to Bastogne. That's 15 men. I knew every one of them. Played cards with them, shared cigarettes, listened to them talk about their families. Then they're gone, burned alive or torn apart, and there's no time to grieve because you've got to keep moving. That's what it was. Just keep moving and try not to think about the guys who didn't make it. The oral history captures him crying, 86 years old, and still traumatized by experiences 60 years past. A Belgian woman, interviewed for a documentary in 2005, remembered the siege of Bastogne from a civilian perspective that American accounts rarely include. We lived in the cellar for 10 days. My family, my neighbours, about 30 people in one basement, no heat, very little food, German shells falling constantly. My little brother was 7. He stopped talking after the 3rd day, just went silent, wouldn't say anything, wouldn't eat. My mother thought he'd die. American soldiers came every day with whatever food they could spare, but they didn't have much themselves. When the town was liberated, when the Americans broke through, I remember a soldier gave my brother chocolate. That's what made him speak again, American chocolate. Silly thing to remember from a battle, but that's what I remember. The kindness of soldiers who had nothing giving what they had to children. Her testimony is a reminder that the Battle of the Bulge wasn't just soldiers fighting soldiers. It was a battle fought in and around communities where civilians lived, suffered, and survived. German veterans' accounts, collected by historians in the decades after the war, provide perspective that complicates simple narratives of American triumph. A former grenadier from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, interviewed in the 1980s, described the offensive's collapse. "We knew by December 24th we'd lost. The fuel was gone, American reinforcements were arriving faster than we could push forward, and the Luftwaffe promised air support that never came. But we kept fighting because orders said fight, because retreating meant being shot by SS execution squads, because what else could we do? I didn't hate the Americans. They were just soldiers like us, doing their jobs. I hated the generals who sent us into this offensive knowing it couldn't succeed, hated Hitler for wasting our lives on his delusions. When I was captured in January, I was relieved. Prison camp meant I'd survive the war. Fighting meant I'd probably die for nothing." His account is typical of Wehrmacht veterans. Recognition that the war was lost, resentment toward leadership that spent lives pointlessly, respect for American soldiers as fighters. The sound of the battle, described by veterans from both sides, was overwhelming and terrifying. "Artillery fire sounds like railroad cars passing overhead," explained a field artilleryman. "Constant noise, rumbling thunder that never stops. Incoming shells have a distinctive whistle. Outgoing sound different, a roar rather than a whistle. After a few days, you learn to distinguish them by sound, know whether to dive for cover or keep working. But the noise is exhausting, wears you down psychologically. You can't escape it, can't rest, can't have a conversation without shouting. Some guys' hearing was permanently damaged, not from close explosions, but from days of continuous noise." Another veteran described tank engines. 50 Shermans with their engines running, sounds like God's own thunderstorm. The ground shakes, you can't hear yourself think. And that was our side. German tanks, Panthers and Tigers, had even louder engines. When you heard those starting up, you knew an attack was coming. The smell of combat, rarely mentioned in official histories, features prominently in veterans' accounts. Cordite from artillery, sharp and chemical, stings your nose and throat. Burning tanks smell like metal and fuel and something sweet that's the crew cooking. You can't mistake it. Once you've smelled burning human flesh, you know it forever. Diesel fumes from trucks and generators. Unwashed bodies, because nobody bathed for weeks. Latrine trenches, decomposing bodies that nobody had time to bury. It all combined into this overwhelming stench that you couldn't escape. Years later, certain smells would take me right back. I'd smell diesel exhaust, and suddenly I'm 20 years old in Belgium again, scared out of my mind, watching my friends die. The sensory memories of combat persisted long after physical wounds healed. The friendships forged during the Bulge lasted lifetimes and defined survivors' post-war lives. Veterans spoke of bonds with men they fought beside, relationships deeper than civilian friendships because they were built on shared trauma and mutual survival. "The guys I served with knew me in ways my wife never could," explained one veteran. "They knew what I'd seen, what I'd done, what it cost to survive. We didn't talk about it much when we got together, didn't need to. Just being around guys who understood was enough." Veterans organizations, battalion reunions, memorial dedications provided opportunities for survivors to gather, remember fallen comrades, and confirm that their experiences mattered. For many Bulge veterans, these relationships remained central to their identities for the rest of their lives. The question of whether survivors felt pride or trauma about their service produced complex answers. Most expressed both. Pride in accomplishing difficult missions under terrible conditions, trauma from experiences that haunted them for decades. "I'm proud I served, proud my unit held when we could have broken, proud we won," said one veteran. But the nightmares never stopped. 60 years later, I still wake up sometimes back in that frozen foxhole, German artillery falling, wondering if the next one has my name on it. You carry combat with you forever. It's not something you get over, you just learn to live with it. The generation that fought the Battle of the Bulge was called the Greatest Generation, a label many veterans rejected as oversimplified. They were ordinary people who endured extraordinary circumstances. Some thrived afterward, others struggled with physical and psychological wounds for the rest of their lives. All of them deserve better than reduction to mythology. The final interviews with Bulge veterans, recorded as they reached their 80s and 90s in the early 2000s, had an elegiac quality. These men knew they were the last witnesses to events that shaped the 20th century. They spoke of responsibility to remember fallen comrades, to ensure their sacrifices weren't forgotten. There were 19,000 American boys who didn't come home from the Bulge, said one veteran in his last recorded interview. They were 18, 19, 20 years old. They died in snow and cold, far from home, fighting for a country that probably forgot them by the time the war ended. I've spent 70 years carrying their memory. When I'm gone, who'll remember them? This is the ultimate question of military history. How do we remember those who died, honor their service, and learn from their sacrifices without romanticizing war or forgetting its costs? The voices of those who fought the Battle of the Bulge provide no easy answers. They only ask that we listen. Today, present day, a tourist bus pulls into the parking lot at Martyrs Memorial outside Bastogne. American visitors, mostly middle-aged, climb out and walk toward the star-shaped monument commemorating the Battle of the Bulge. The memorial, completed in 1950, bears the names of more than 76,000 American soldiers who fought in the Ardennes. Most visitors don't know that the actual casualty figure was 89,500, or that Belgian civilians and German soldiers also died by the thousands. They've come because they've heard of Bastogne, because a grandfather served here, because they've seen Band of Brothers and want to see where it happened. They walk through the memorial reading names, most of which mean nothing to them, occasionally finding one they recognize. A tour guide explains the battle in 15 minutes, reducing 6 weeks of combat to a simple narrative. Germans attacked, Americans held, Patton relieved Bastogne, Allies won. It's not wrong, it's incomplete. The full story is more complex, more costly, more human, but complexity doesn't fit on memorial plaques or in 15-minute tour guide speeches. So the Battle of the Bulge is remembered in simplified form, preserved in bronze and stone, slowly fading from living memory into history. The historical consensus on the Battle of the Bulge has evolved significantly over 75 years, but centers on several key points. First, the German offensive was strategically irrational, risking resources Germany couldn't afford to lose for objectives it couldn't realistically achieve. Second, Allied forces, though surprised initially, responded effectively with flexible command structures, enabling rapid concentration of force. Third, the battle shortened the war by destroying German offensive capability, but at enormous cost in casualties. Fourth, individual courage and unit cohesion mattered more than grand strategy in determining outcomes. And fifth, the battle demonstrated that modern industrial warfare favors nations with superior logistics and production capacity over those with superior tactical skill. These conclusions are as close to consensus as military history achieves. Debates continue about details, command decisions, what-ifs, but the broad strokes are settled. The continuing debates among historians focus on three main areas. First, intelligence failure. Why did Allied intelligence miss clear indicators of the German offensive, and what systemic problems did that failure reveal? Second, operational choices. Would different tactics have achieved the same results at lower cost? And specifically, was Patton's aggressive approach optimal or unnecessarily costly? Third, strategic significance. Did the battle truly shorten the war, or did it simply delay Allied advances that would have occurred anyway? These debates aren't academic exercises. They have implications for how military forces prepare for future conflicts, how commanders balance speed against casualties, how intelligence warnings are evaluated. The Battle of the Bulge remains relevant because the questions it raises about military effectiveness, command responsibility, and the costs of victory remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The Cold War context in which the Battle of the Bulge was first memorialized shaped how Americans remember it. In the 1950s and 60s, the battle became a founding myth of American military excellence, proof that American soldiers could defeat the best forces authoritarian regimes could field. The fact that Soviet forces on the Eastern Front faced far more German divisions and suffered far higher casualties was downplayed. The narrative focused on American achievement, using Bastogne as evidence of superior fighting spirit and democratic values. This wasn't entirely propaganda. American forces did fight well and win. But the Cold War memory emphasized triumph and minimized cost, creating a sanitized version that veterans often found unrecognizable. The soldiers who fought at Bastogne knew it wasn't a glorious victory, but a grinding, costly battle won through endurance as much as heroism. That complexity disappeared in popular memory. Modern military forces study the Battle of the Bulge for operational lessons that remain relevant. The importance of strategic reserves, maintaining uncommitted forces that can respond to unexpected developments, the value of flexible command structures, ability to shift units between commands without bureaucratic friction, the necessity of joint operations, coordination between ground forces, artillery, and air power. The criticality of logistics. Even tactical victories fail without adequate supply lines. And the unpredictability of weather, environmental conditions can enable or prevent operations regardless of planning. These lessons are incorporated into military education at staff colleges and war colleges. Officers study the Ardennes as a case study in crisis management, learning both what worked and what failed. The battle's tactical details are less relevant in an age of precision weapons and digital communications. The operational principles remain valid. What's been forgotten about the Battle of the Bulge is as significant as what's remembered. Civilian suffering, Belgian families who lost homes and loved ones, rarely appears in American accounts. German perspectives, the experiences of Wehrmacht soldiers fighting a lost cause, are marginalized in narratives that focus on American heroism. Non-battle casualties, the thousands who suffered frostbite, trench foot, and combat fatigue, don't feature in popular histories that emphasize combat deaths. The political controversies, particularly Montgomery's temporary command of American forces in the North, have been smoothed over in modern accounts. The logistical achievement, perhaps the most impressive aspect of American performance, receives less attention than combat operations. And the sheer randomness of who lived and who died, the role of luck in survival, contradicts narratives that emphasize skill and courage. Memory is selective. The Battle of the Bulge, we remember, is cleaner, simpler, and more heroic than the battle that actually occurred. The physical landscape of the Ardennes today bears few visible scars from the battle. Villages destroyed in 1944 have been rebuilt. Forests have regrown. Roads are paved and peaceful. Tourists drive routes that 4th Armoured Division fought along, unaware of the blood spilled on ground they're passing. Cemeteries preserve memory. Luxembourg American Cemetery, with its 5,000 white crosses. Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium. German cemeteries that few Americans visit. These spaces maintain physical connection to the battle, places where the dead are honoured and history is preserved, but they're also anachronistic, preserving a version of warfare that no longer exists. Modern combat looks nothing like the Bulge. Precision weapons, digital communications, drone surveillance have transformed battlefield dynamics. The trenches and tanks and artillery barrages that define the Ardennes are artifacts of industrial-age warfare. What remains relevant is human courage, fear, sacrifice, the psychological cost of combat that technology hasn't eliminated. Why the Battle of the Bulge still matters 75 years later isn't obvious. It didn't change the war's outcome, which was determined by industrial production and strategic bombing as much as ground combat. It wasn't the largest battle of World War II, small compared to Eastern Front engagements. It didn't introduce new tactics or technologies that transformed warfare, yet it persists in American memory when larger battles have faded. Perhaps because it was the last time American forces faced existential threat in conventional warfare, the last moment when Allied victory seemed uncertain. Perhaps because the human stories, Bastogne's siege and Patton's relief, provide narrative drama that other battles lack. Perhaps because it occurred at Christmas, adding poignancy to suffering. Or perhaps because every generation needs to believe that their sacrifices mattered, that the costs they paid weren't wasted. The Battle of the Bulge matters because it represents something larger than tactics and operations. It represents the price democracies pay to defend themselves against authoritarianism. That remains relevant. The lasting legacy of the Battle of the Bulge isn't found in grand strategy or operational maneuvers. It's found in the experience of soldiers who fought through winter conditions against determined enemies, endured hardships that tested human limits, and survived to build the post-war world. They didn't stop the German offensive because of superior tactics or brilliant leadership, though both contributed. They stopped it through stubborn refusal to quit, through bonds with men fighting beside them, through belief that what they were doing mattered enough to justify the cost. That's not a comfortable legacy. It doesn't provide clear lessons or actionable conclusions, but it's honest. War is terrible, necessary when forced upon you, survivable through courage and luck and the competence of the guy next to you. The soldiers of the Battle of the Bulge understood this. They fought anyway. They won. Many died. Those who survived carried the memories for the rest of their lives. December 16th, 2024, 80 years after the German offensive began, snow falls on the Ardennes, covering the same fields where Americans and Germans killed each other 8 decades earlier. A handful of veterans, now in their late 90s or early hundreds, are still alive, but too frail to travel to memorial ceremonies. Their children and grandchildren gather instead, laying wreaths at monuments, listening to speeches about sacrifice and freedom. The speeches are well-intentioned but abstract, reducing lived experience to inspirational platitudes. The veterans, had they been able to attend, probably would have said little. They'd shake hands with fellow survivors, share a look that conveyed more than words could, and remember friends who didn't make it home. That's what the Battle of the Bulge means to those who fought it. Not grand strategy, but personal loss. Not triumph, but survival. Not glory, but the simple fact of having endured something terrible and lived to see the other side.